I stood in front of the mirror wearing the wedding dress I dreamed about my whole life. White lace, delicate beading, everything perfect except for the way my family looked at me. My sister leaned close to her friend and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "She looks like a fat pig bride in that dress." My mother laughed. My father said nothing. I wanted to disappear. But I didn't know that in 72 hours at my wedding reception, my fiancé would stand up, take the microphone and say 7 words that would shatter everything they thought they knew about me. The room went dead silent. My mother dropped her fork. Because what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I wasn't just some pathetic woman marrying up. I was the one holding all the power. I was the one who'd been playing the long game while they treated me like I was nothing. And when the truth finally came out, let's just say, the people who spent a lifetime making me feel small were about to learn exactly how big I'd become. This is the story of how I went from invisible daughter to unstoppable. And trust me, you won't believe what happens next. My name is Kelly Hughes. I'm 34 years old, and for the past decade I've built a successful career as a financial consultant in Boston. I have my own apartment in the North End, a job that pays well, and a life that, on paper, looks like everything I worked for. But success in business doesn't buy you respect at the dinner table where you grew up. And that's a lesson I've learned over and over again every single time I sit across from my family. It was January, the coldest month of the year, and my mother Elaine was turning 62. She'd insisted on hosting her birthday dinner at the house, the same house where I'd spent my childhood feeling like a ghost. I arrived on time carrying an expensive bottle of wine I knew she'd barely acknowledge, and the moment I stepped through the door, I could feel it, that familiar weight, the invisible pressure of being the daughter nobody quite knows what to do with. My younger sister, Melissa, was already there, of course. She's 32, 2 years younger than me, and everything I've never been. Blonde, where I'm brunette. Thin, where I'm curvy. Effortlessly charming, where I've always been quietly competent. She was draped across the couch in a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, laughing at something our father said. When she saw me, she gave me that smile, the one that looks warm to everyone else, but feels like ice to me. "Kelly, you made it," she said, standing up to hug me. It was the kind of hug that doesn't actually touch the kind where you lean in just enough to look affectionate from a distance. "Of course I made it," I said quietly. "It's Mum's birthday." Dinner was the usual performance. My mother held court at the head of the table, talking about her garden club, her book club, her upcoming trip to Martha's Vineyard with her friends. My father nodded along occasionally, interjecting with a story about his golf game. And Melissa. Melissa glowed. She talked about her new job at a marketing firm, about the apartment she was decorating in the South End, about the man she'd been seeing who worked in finance. I sat there, eating my salmon, answering questions, when they were directed at me, which wasn't often. When my mother finally asked what I'd been up to, I mentioned a major client I'd just signed, a company whose financial turnaround I'd engineered almost single-handedly. She nodded politely and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning back to Melissa to ask about her vacation plans. It was after dessert, when I excused myself to use the restroom, that I heard it. I was walking down the hallway when Melissa's voice drifted out from the living room, sharp and clear. "Honestly, Mum, I don't know why Kelly even bothers showing up to these things. She just sits there like a lump. She's been the family embarrassment since we were kids." I froze. My hand was on the bathroom door handle, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mother's laugh was soft, indulgent. "Melissa, don't be cruel." But she didn't sound like she disagreed. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the wallpaper I'd grown up with, feeling 34 years of small slights and quiet dismissals collapse into a single burning moment. And then Melissa said something else, something that made my heart stop. "Anyway, I ran into Daniel Miller last week. Remember him from high school? He's back in Boston." That name. I hadn't heard it in 16 years. The boy whose family I'd saved in secret, the one who never knew it was me. I walked back to the dining room on autopilot, my mind spinning back through time. Daniel Miller. I could still see his face the way it looked in senior year. Tired, worried, older than 18. I remembered the way he'd stopped showing up to debate club, the way his clothes started looking worn, the way he'd sit alone at lunch staring at nothing. Everyone noticed, but nobody really understood what was happening to his family. Nobody except me. It was the spring of our senior year when the rumours started. Daniel's father had owned a small construction company, the kind that employed 20 people and had been in the family for generations. But then the housing market crashed, contracts dried up, and suddenly the Millers were facing bankruptcy. I heard about it because my father played golf with someone who knew someone, and one night at dinner he mentioned it casually, the way you mention the weather. Jim Miller's company went under, he'd said, reaching for the salt. Shame. Good man. They'll probably lose the house. My mother had made a sympathetic sound and changed the subject. Melissa hadn't even looked up from her phone. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, who'd always been kind to me in a school where kindness wasn't currency. He'd been my lab partner in chemistry sophomore year, and when I'd frozen during a presentation too anxious to speak, he'd stepped in smoothly and covered for me without making me feel small about it. He probably didn't even remember that. But I did. So I started tutoring. I'd always been good at math and English, and I put up flyers around town offering SAT prep, algebra help, essay coaching. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 regular clients. I charged $40 an hour, which felt like a fortune to me then. I worked every afternoon after school and most of Saturday mornings. My family assumed I was just being studious, studying at the library or working on college applications. I never told them the truth. For 6 months, I barely slept. I'd tutor until 8 or 9 at night, then come home and do my own homework until midnight. I watched my savings account grow slowly, painfully, $40 at a time, 80, 120. I kept a notebook where I tracked every cent, calculating how long it would take to reach $5,000. That was the number I'd heard, the amount the Millers needed to avoid foreclosure, at least temporarily. I didn't know if it was accurate, but it became my target. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the secrecy. I couldn't tell anyone what I was doing because I knew how it would sound. Pathetic Kelly crushing on some boy trying to buy his attention. My family would have laughed. Melissa definitely would have laughed. So I kept it to myself, this one good thing I was trying to do. By November, I had $4,800. Close enough. I went to our school counsellor, Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman who'd always treated me with more warmth than my own mother did. I told her I wanted to create an anonymous community scholarship fund to help a family in need, and I asked if she could help me deliver it without revealing my identity. She looked at me for a long moment, and I thought she might ask questions I didn't want to answer, but instead she just nodded and said, "You have a good heart, Kelly." She contacted Daniel's mother through the school's family services program. She told her that an anonymous community fund had been established to help families facing hardship, and that they'd been selected as recipients. She made it sound official, legitimate, like something that happened all the time. Mrs. Patterson was good at that. I never told Daniel. I never told anyone. I watched from a distance as the foreclosure was delayed, as his father found consulting work, as Daniel's face slowly lost that haunted, exhausted look. We graduated in June. I went to Boston University. Daniel went to Northeastern. We lost touch the way high school classmates do, our lives moving in different directions. And I never, ever expected to hear his name again in my mother's living room, spoken casually by my sister, like it meant nothing at all. I sat back down at the dinner table, my hands shaking slightly as I picked up my wine glass. Melissa was still talking, animated and bright. "He looks amazing," she was saying. "Really successful. He's back in Boston running some investment company. We're getting coffee next week." Of course she was. Of course Melissa, who'd never noticed Daniel in high school, who dated the quarterback and the student body president and anyone else who could raise her social status, was suddenly interested now that he was successful. I finished my wine and left as soon as I could, pleading an early morning meeting. Nobody seemed particularly disappointed to see me go. 2 weeks passed. I threw myself into work, trying to forget the sound of Melissa calling me an embarrassment, trying not to think about Daniel Miller and the $5,000 he never knew came from me. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in early February, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I glanced at the screen and my heart stopped. "Kelly, it's Daniel Miller. I'd really like to see you again." I stared at my phone for a full minute, reading the message 3 times to make sure it was real. Daniel Miller. After 16 years of silence, he'd somehow found my number and wanted to see me. My first instinct was to wonder if Melissa had mentioned me, if she'd told him we'd both be at some family gathering, and he was just being polite, but the message felt personal, direct. He wanted to see me specifically. I typed and deleted 4 different responses before settling on something simple. "Hi, Daniel. It's been a long time. I'd love to catch up. Professional. Friendly, not too eager." I hit send before I could overthink it further. His response came within minutes. "How about coffee this Saturday? There's a place called Cafe Vittoria in the North End. Does 11 work?" Saturday, 3 days away. I agreed and spent those 3 days in a state of low-grade anxiety I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was just coffee with an old classmate, nothing more. I tried not to think about the fact that I'd once worked myself to exhaustion to save his family. I tried not to wonder if he'd somehow found out, if that was why he was reaching out now. Saturday morning, I changed my outfit 4 times before settling on dark jeans and a burgundy sweater that made me feel put together without trying too hard. I arrived at Cafe Vittoria 10 minutes early, chose a table near the window and ordered an espresso I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. At 11:05, the door opened and Daniel walked in. He looked different, older obviously, but also more solid, somehow more certain of himself. He'd filled out since high school, his shoulders broader, his face more defined. He wore a charcoal pea coat and a dark scarf, and when he spotted me, his face broke into a smile that made me remember exactly why I'd noticed him all those years ago. "Kelly," he said, walking toward my table, "it's so good to see you." I stood up and we had one of those awkward should we hug moments before settling on a brief friendly embrace. He smelled like expensive cologne and winter air. "You too?" I said, meaning it. "It's been forever." 16 years, he said, pulling out the chair across from me. "I can't believe it's been that long." He was about to say something else when the door opened again and my entire body went cold. Melissa walked in. She was wearing a white wool coat and knee-high boots, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile bright and proprietary. She walked straight to our table as if she'd been expected all along. "Sorry I'm late," she said cheerfully, and before I could process what was happening, she leaned down and kissed Daniel on the cheek. Then she looked at me and her smile shifted into something I knew well, something that looked warm to outsiders but felt like a knife. "Kelly, what a surprise. Daniel didn't mention you'd be here." I looked at Daniel, whose expression had shifted from welcoming to confused to uncomfortable in the span of about 3 seconds. "I didn't know you two knew each other," he said, looking between us. "We're sisters," Melissa said brightly, settling into the chair next to Daniel and linking her arm through his in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. "Didn't Kelly mention that we haven't had a chance to talk yet?" I said quietly, my hands wrapped around my espresso cup so tightly I thought it might shatter. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "Sisters? Wow, I had no idea." He glanced at Melissa, then back at me. "I reached out to Kelly because we were friends in high school. I've been trying to reconnect with people from back then." "That's sweet," Melissa said, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite sincerity. "Daniel and I actually dated casually back in high school. On and off, you know how it is. And now we've been reconnecting lately." She squeezed his arm. "It's been really nice." I didn't remember Daniel and Melissa dating in high school. I would have remembered that. But then again, I'd spent senior year working 3 tutoring jobs and avoiding most social events. Maybe I'd missed it. Or maybe Melissa was rewriting history the way she always did, making herself central to every narrative. "I didn't realize you two were in touch," I said, carefully directing the comment at Daniel. He shifted in his seat, and I could see the discomfort on his face. "Melissa reached out a few weeks ago. We got coffee caught up on old times." He paused. "But I wanted to talk to you specifically, Kelly, about something from back then." Melissa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, I'm here now, so we can all catch up together. Isn't this cozy, the 3 of us?" The next 40 minutes were excruciating. Melissa dominated the conversation, telling stories about high school that painted her as the centre of every memory, laughing at her own jokes, touching Daniel's arm repeatedly. Daniel tried several times to redirect the conversation toward me, asking about my work, my life in Boston, but Melissa always found a way to pull focus back to herself. I sat there maintaining a pleasant expression, sipping coffee I couldn't taste, feeling like I was watching a performance I hadn't auditioned for. This was my life. This had always been my life. Melissa taking up all the space and me sitting quietly in the margins. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced at my watch and made an apologetic face. "I have to run, I have a client meeting this afternoon I need to prepare for." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Daniel stood up immediately. "Of course, it was really good to see you, Kelly." Melissa stayed seated, her arm still linked with Daniel's. "We should do this again sometime," she said. "Family coffee dates." I smiled politely, said goodbye, and walked out into the cold February air, feeling like I couldn't breathe. That evening, I was halfway through a glass of wine and a spreadsheet I wasn't really concentrating on when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Kelly," Daniel's voice. "I'm sorry about the awkwardness today. I need to talk to you alone about something important from the past." My heart was beating too fast. I set down my wine glass and moved away from my laptop, as if Daniel could somehow see through the phone that I'd been pretending to work, while actually replaying every uncomfortable moment from this morning. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual. "What's going on?" "Can we meet tomorrow?" he asked. There was an urgency in his voice I hadn't heard earlier. "Just the 2 of us. I promise no surprise appearances this time." "What about Melissa?" The question came out before I could stop it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's actually part of what I need to talk to you about. Please, Kelly. Tomorrow morning, same place, 10 o'clock. I agreed, though every instinct told me I was setting myself up for more disappointment. Sunday morning was grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that matches uncertain moods. I arrived at Cafe Vittoria 5 minutes late, on purpose, not wanting to seem too eager. Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table far from the windows, 2 cups of coffee waiting. He stood up when he saw me, and this time there was no hesitation in his greeting. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down. "I wasn't sure you would after yesterday." "It was awkward," I admitted, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. "I didn't know you and Melissa were involved." "We're not," he said quickly. "That's the first thing I need to clear up. Melissa reached out to me about 3 weeks ago through LinkedIn. She suggested we get coffee catch-up on old times. I thought, why not? We're all adults now, and honestly, I barely remember dating her in high school. It was so brief and insignificant." I took a sip of coffee, saying nothing, letting him continue. "We went out twice," Daniel said. "Both times she talked non-stop about herself. Her job, her apartment, her social life. It felt less like catching up and more like a performance. After the second coffee, I told her I didn't think we had much in common anymore. I thought that was the end of it." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Then yesterday, she texted me asking where we were meeting for coffee. I told her I was meeting an old friend. She showed up anyway. She's good at that," I said quietly. "Showing up where she's not invited and making it seem like it was the plan all along." Daniel looked at me carefully. You two don't get along. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. We're very different people. I noticed. He paused. Kelly, the reason I reached out to you has nothing to do with Melissa. I've been back in Boston for 6 months, and I've been thinking a lot about high school, about the people who mattered. You were always kind to me. You were one of the few people who treated me like a person instead of a social equation. I felt my throat tighten. You remember that? Of course I do. You were my lab partner in chemistry. You were patient when I didn't understand something, and you never made me feel stupid. And senior year, when things got really bad with my family, you were one of the only people who didn't treat me differently. He looked down at his coffee. I always regretted that we lost touch after graduation. I went to Northeastern, you went to BU, and somehow we just drifted it into different orbits. I should have tried harder to stay in contact. We were 18, I said softly. Everyone drifts apart after high school. Maybe, he said, but I've thought about you over the years. Wondered how you were doing, what you were up to. When I moved back to Boston and started reaching out to old friends, you were one of the first people I wanted to find. There was something in his voice, something genuine and warm, that made me want to believe him. But 16 years of family dynamics had taught me to be cautious with hope. So what did you want to talk about? I asked. You mentioned something important from the past. Daniel took a breath. Actually, it's more about the present, Kelly. I looked you up. I know you're a financial consultant, and from what I can tell, you're exceptional at what you do. I saw some of the companies you've worked with, the restructuring projects you've handled. He met my eyes. My company is in trouble, serious trouble. Millennium Holdings, maybe you've heard of it. I had. It was a mid-sized investment firm with a solid reputation, the kind of company that made steady money without making headlines. What kind of trouble? The kind that keeps me up at night, he said grimly. We made some investments 2 years ago that looked promising but turned toxic. Our CFO didn't catch the warning signs until it was too late. We're hemorrhaging money, and if we don't turn things around in the next 6 months, we're looking at bankruptcy or a fire sale to a competitor. He leaned forward. I need the best consultant I can find, Kelly. Someone who can look at our books with fresh eyes and find solutions everyone else has missed. I'm not asking as an old friend. I'm asking as a businessman who needs help. Will you at least look at it? I studied his face, looking for any sign that this was charity, that he was offering me work out of pity or obligation. But all I saw was genuine concern and something that looked like respect. Send me your financial statements, I said finally. All of them, 3 years back. I'll do a preliminary analysis and let you know if I can help. The relief on his face was palpable. Thank you, seriously, thank you. We talked for another hour about his company, about my work, about Boston and how the city had changed. It felt easy, natural, like talking to someone who actually saw me instead of looking through me. When we finally parted ways, he gave me a hug that lasted a second longer than professional, and I felt something shift inside me. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. That afternoon, he sent me the files. I spent 3 weeks analysing their books, running models, stress testing scenarios. I worked late into the night, barely sleeping, driven by something more than professional obligation. When I finally saw the solution, when the pieces clicked into place, and I understood exactly what needed to happen, I sat back in my chair and stared at my laptop screen. I wasn't just saving his company, I was about to save his entire future. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, which is often the case with the best financial strategies. Millennium Holdings didn't need a dramatic overhaul, it needed surgical precision. The toxic investments could be isolated, restructured, and gradually liquidated, while the healthy portfolios were repositioned to attract new capital. I'd identified 3 potential institutional investors who would be interested in a partial stake if the company could demonstrate stability. The math worked. The timeline was aggressive but achievable. It would take 18 months of careful execution, but Daniel's company would survive. I presented my findings to Daniel and his executive team on a rainy Tuesday morning in late March. I'd prepared a 60-page report with financial projections, risk assessments, and implementation timelines. I walked them through every detail, answering questions, defending my assumptions, explaining why this approach would work when others had failed. Daniel's CFO, a sharp woman named Patricia, who'd initially been skeptical of bringing in an outside consultant, was the first to speak when I finished. "This is brilliant," she said simply. "I don't know why we didn't see it." "Because you were too close to it," I replied. "Sometimes you need outside eyes." Daniel had been quiet throughout the presentation, listening intently, taking notes. Now he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "When can you start implementing this?" "I can start immediately," I said. "But I need full access to your financial systems and authority to make decisions without committee approval. This only works if we move quickly." "Done," Daniel said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." Over the next 6 weeks, I essentially lived at Millennium Holdings. I arrived early, left late, worked weekends. I restructured debt agreements, negotiated with creditors, pitched to potential investors. Daniel worked alongside me, learning, asking questions, trusting my judgment, even when it went against his instincts. We developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of how the other person thought and worked. It was during those long hours sitting across conference room tables littered with financial reports and cold coffee that I started to notice the way Daniel looked at me. Not the polite attention of a client, but something deeper. He'd pause mid-sentence sometimes, just watching me think through a problem, and there'd be this expression on his face, respect mixed with something warmer. By mid-April, the crisis had stabilised. The toxic investments were contained. 2 of the 3 institutional investors had committed capital, and Millennium Holdings' balance sheet was starting to look healthy again. Patricia pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You saved us. I hope Daniel's paying you what you're worth." He'd tried. I had submitted a consulting invoice that I considered fair, substantial, but fair. Daniel had looked at it and shaken his head. "This isn't enough. Not for what you've done." "It's my standard rate," I'd protested. "You didn't do standard work," he'd replied. "You saved my company, Kelly. You saved 15 years of my life and 200 jobs. A consulting fee doesn't cover that." 2 days later, his lawyer called me to schedule a meeting. I arrived at the law offices as confused, wondering if there was some legal issue with the restructuring I hadn't anticipated. Instead, I was presented with a thick document titled Equity Compensation Agreement. "Miss Miller wants to offer you 51% voting shares in Millennium Holdings." The lawyer explained, a distinguished man in his 60s named Robert Chen. "The shares will vest over 12 months. You'll have majority ownership and all associated voting rights once vesting is complete." I stared at him. "That's not necessary. I did my job. He's paying me for that." "He insists," Robert said. "And, frankly, Ms. Hughes, this is generous but not unprecedented for C-suite consultants who perform company-saving work. I've structured similar agreements before." I had him send the documents to my own lawyer, a woman I'd worked with for years named Jennifer Park. She reviewed everything carefully and called me that evening. "It's legitimate," she said. "Very generous, yes, but the structure is sound. He's essentially making you a partner in recognition of the value you created. If you're comfortable with that level of involvement with the company, I'd advise you to sign." I signed, though something about it felt surreal, almost too good to be true. I thought Daniel was being overly grateful that the equity was a symbolic gesture of appreciation rather than a literal transfer of power. The paperwork was dense and technical, and I focused on the vesting timeline and tax implications rather than dwelling on what it actually meant. In 12 months, I'd owned 51% of a company I'd just saved. It felt abstract, hypothetical, like something that would matter later but not now. What mattered now was the way Daniel started finding excuses to have coffee with me after meetings. The way our working dinners turned into actual dinners, where we talked about things that had nothing to do with business. The way he'd started looking at me like I was the most fascinating person in the room, even when we were alone, and there was no one else to compare me to. My family knew nothing about any of this. I didn't mention Millennium Holdings at Sunday dinners, didn't talk about the 70-hour weeks or the company I was rebuilding, or the equity agreement sitting in my filing cabinet. It was mine, this one piece of my life where I was valued and respected and seen. I wasn't ready to share it with people who'd spent 34 years teaching me I wasn't worth noticing. On a quiet April evening, Daniel asked me to take a walk with him. We ended up at the Charles River, watching the sunset paint the water orange and gold. We'd been talking about nothing in particular, the weather, a movie he'd seen plans for the weekend, when he suddenly stopped walking and turned to face me. "Kelly," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my heart start racing. "I need to tell you something." I waited, barely breathing. "These past 2 months working with you have been the best months I've had in years. Not just because you saved my company, though. Obviously, I'm grateful for that. But because I've gotten to know you, the real you, and I've realised something." He took my hand. "I've realised that I trust you more than anyone I've ever known. You see the world clearly and honestly, and you make me want to be better than I am." "Daniel," I started, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. I know this might seem fast, and maybe it is, but I'm 34 years old and I've dated enough to know when something is real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "Kelly, will you marry me?" Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the city faded, the traffic on Memorial Drive, the joggers passing by, the distant laughter from a group of college students, all of it disappeared until there was only Daniel's face and the small velvet box in his hand and the impossible question hanging in the air between us. He opened the box. The ring inside was simple and elegant, a single diamond on a platinum band that caught the last rays of sunset and threw light across the water. It was exactly the kind of ring I would have chosen for myself if I'd ever let myself imagine this moment, which I hadn't because girls who grow up invisible don't spend time dreaming about proposals. "I know we haven't been dating long in the traditional sense," Daniel continued, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice now, the vulnerability. "But Kelly, I feel like I've known you forever, or maybe like I've been looking for you forever and just didn't realise it until now. You're the most genuine person I've ever met. You don't play games, you don't pretend to be something you're not, and you see through all the noise to what actually matters." He paused, searching my face. "I don't want to waste any more time. I wasted 16 years after high school not staying in touch with you. I don't want to waste another day not being completely honest about what I want. And what I want is you, for the rest of my life." Tears were streaming down my face before I even realised I was crying. Not delicate, pretty tears, but the kind that come from somewhere deep and unguarded, the kind that carry 34 years of feeling not quite good enough, not quite worthy, not quite seen. And here was this man, this brilliant, successful, genuinely kind man, looking at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. "Yes," I whispered, and then louder, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Daniel's face transformed. Pure joy, unfiltered and radiant. He took the ring from the box with shaking hands and slid it onto my finger. It fit perfectly, like he'd somehow known, like he'd paid attention to details no one else ever bothered with. Then he pulled me into his arms and kissed me, and I kissed him back, and it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, but had always been searching for. We stood there by the water as the sun finished setting, wrapped in each other, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not too much, not too little, not invisible, not embarrassing, just exactly right. "I love you," Daniel said against my hair. I should have said that first, probably. "I love you, Kelly." "I love you too," I said, and meant it with an intensity that frightened me. I'd never been in love before, not really. I dated in college and afterward, but nothing that ever felt like this. nothing that ever felt real. We walked back to his car, hand in hand, stopping every few minutes just to look at each other and laugh at how absurdly happy we were. He took me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, and we talked about everything: when we'd get married, where we'd live, what kind of ceremony we wanted. Daniel wanted something small and meaningful, which was exactly what I wanted. We agreed on a summer wedding, intimate and simple, just close friends and family. Family. The word landed in my chest with a dull thud. I should probably tell my parents, or Liz, I said, looking down at the ring on my finger. It felt heavy, suddenly weighted with implications I hadn't considered in the golden haze of the proposal. Of course, Daniel said. Do you want to tell them together? I should probably meet them officially anyway. I thought about my mother's birthday dinner, about Melissa calling me the family embarrassment, about 34 years of being overlooked and underestimated. Let me tell them first, I said. Alone, they're complicated. Daniel squeezed my hand. Families usually are. But he didn't understand, not really. How could he? He'd grown up in a family that faced bankruptcy together, that supported each other through crisis. He had no frame of reference for what mine was like. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I tried to imagine how the conversation would go. My mother's polite surprise. My father's awkward congratulations. And Melissa, what would Melissa say? She'd made those possessive gestures at the coffee shop, linked her arm through Daniel's like he belonged to her. Would she be angry? Would she try to claim he'd been hers first? I pushed the thoughts away and focused on the ring catching moonlight from my bedroom window. Daniel loved me. He'd chosen me. That was real, and it was mine, and nothing my family said could diminish it. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. Sunday brunch, the weekly ritual I usually dreaded. I arrived early before Melissa, wanting to tell them privately. My mother was in the kitchen, arranging pastries on a platter, and my father was reading the newspaper in the living room. Mum, Dad, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I have some news. My mother looked up, immediately suspicious of my tone. My father lowered his newspaper. I held up my left hand, letting the ring speak for itself. I'm engaged. There was a beat of silence. Then another. My father's eyebrows rose. My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked uncomfortably like disapproval. Engaged. My mother repeated, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You getting married. The emphasis on that first word landed like a slap. You. As if the concept of me getting married was inherently absurd. Yes, I said, keeping my voice level. His name is Daniel Miller. We went to high school together, and we've been... Kelly, my mother interrupted, setting down the pastry platter with a sharp clink. Are you sure he knows what he's doing? The question hung in the air like smoke. Are you sure he knows what he's doing? Not congratulations, not expressions of happiness or even curiosity about the man I was going to marry. Just immediate, instinctive doubt that anyone would choose me intentionally. He knows exactly what he's doing, I said quietly, my hand dropping to my side. He proposed to me. Mum, he loves me. My mother made a small sound that might have been sympathy but felt more like pity. Sweetheart, I'm just concerned. You barely mentioned you were seeing anyone, and now suddenly you're engaged. It seems very fast. Are you sure you're not rushing into something because you're worried about being alone? I'm not worried about being alone, I said, my voice tighter now. I've been alone most of my life. I'm good at it. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. This was his pattern discomfort without intervention, concern without courage. What does this man do? My mother asked, crossing her arms. What's his background? His name is Daniel. I repeated, emphasizing it because she'd already managed to reduce him to this man. He runs an investment company. He's successful, he's kind, and he treats me with respect. Investment company, my mother repeated as if testing the words for authenticity. And how did you two meet? Before I could answer, the front door opened and Melissa's voice rang through the house. Sorry, I'm late. Traffic was insane. She breezed into the kitchen, wearing a white sundress and oversized sunglasses, looking like she'd just stepped off someone's yacht. Then she saw my face, saw my mother's expression, and her smile sharpened. What's going on? Your sister is engaged, my mother said flatly. Melissa's eyes went straight to my hand. I watched her face change as she registered the ring as she processed the information. For just a moment, something raw and ugly flashed across her features before the mask of polite interest slid back into place. Engaged, she said slowly. To who? Daniel Miller, I said, meeting her eyes directly. We went to high school together. The name landed exactly as I knew it would. Melissa's perfectly composed expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the anger underneath. Daniel Miller, she repeated. My Daniel. He was never yours, Melissa. We dated, she said, her voice rising. We had history. You had coffee twice last month, I said. He told me. He also told me he made it clear he wasn't interested. My mother held up a hand. Girls, please, this isn't the time for old rivalries. She turned to me. Kelly, I think we should all sit down and discuss this properly. This is a big decision, and I want to make sure you've thought it through. We moved to the dining room, and my mother insisted on making this a formal Sunday dinner, despite the fact that it was barely 11 in the morning. She pulled out the china set the table, as if we were hosting dignitaries, and served quiche and fruit salad, with a tight smile that told me exactly what she thought of this situation. My father sat at the head of the table, radiating discomfort. Melissa sat across from me, her eyes never leaving my face, calculating. So, my mother said, settling into her chair with the air of someone about to conduct an intervention. Tell us about the proposal. I described it briefly, the walk by the Charles River, the sunset, the simple sincerity of the moment. With every detail I shared, I watched my mother's expression grow more skeptical and Melissa's smile grow more cruel. How romantic, Melissa said when I finished, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite sarcasm but close. Daniel always did have a soft heart. He probably felt sorry for you after that awkward coffee we all had. Melissa, my father said weakly. It was the first word he had spoken since I'd arrived. What? I'm just being honest? Melissa leaned forward, her elbows on the table. Daniel and I have always had chemistry. Everyone could see it. He must pity you, sis. That's the only explanation that makes sense. Something cold settled in my chest. This was the moment when my father should have told her to stop, when my mother should have defended me, when someone in this family should have said that what Melissa just said was cruel and unacceptable. Instead, my mother just sighed. Kelly, she said in that tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. You have to admit, this does seem sudden. And Daniel is very successful, very handsome. I'm sure he has many options. You should wake up from this fantasy before you embarrass yourself. The words hit like a physical blow. Not because they were surprising, I'd heard variations of this my entire life, but because some part of me had hoped foolishly that my engagement might be the thing that finally made them see me differently. We're planning a small wedding, I said, my voice hollow. This summer, intimate, just close friends and family. My mother and Melissa exchanged a look, then they both started laughing. Not malicious laughter exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes from finding something absurd impossible to take seriously. My father looked down at his plate. Wedding, Melissa said through her laughter. This summer. Oh, Kelly, that's precious. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm leaving. Kelly, sit down, my mother said, not unkindly. We're just trying to protect you. No, I said. You're not. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Melissa's voice light and mocking. Don't worry, sis. I'll definitely be at your wedding. I wouldn't miss this joke for the world. I should have known better than to invite my mother dress shopping. I should have gone alone or brought a friend or just ordered something online and been done with it. But some stubborn, hopeful part of me still wanted. This wanted one traditional mother-daughter moment that felt normal, that felt like the kind of memory other women got to have. So when my mother called in early June and suggested we go to a bridal boutique in Newbury Street, I'd said yes. The boutique was elegant and expensive, all cream-coloured walls and soft lighting designed to make every bride feel beautiful. A consultant named Marie greeted us with champagne and led us to a private fitting area. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, and for a moment, I let myself believe this might actually be nice. What kind of style are you thinking? Marie asked, pulling out a tablet to show me options. A-line ball gown mermaid sheath. Something simple, I said. Classic. Maybe lace. My mother, sitting on the velvet couch with her champagne, made a small humming sound. Simple is probably best. We don't want anything too form-fitting. Marie's smile didn't waver, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. She'd done this job long enough to recognise the dynamic unfolding in her fitting room. I tried on 6 dresses. The first was beautiful ivory lace with delicate beading and a sweetheart neckline. When I stepped out of the fitting room, Marie clasped her hands together. Oh, you look stunning. My mother tilted her head, studying me the way you'd study a painting you weren't sure about. The white makes you look heavier, she said finally. Maybe try something with more structure. Something that holds you in. The second dress had a corset bodice that made it hard to breathe. The third had too much fabric. The fourth was trying too hard. The fifth made my shoulders look broad. With each dress, Marie's compliments became more enthusiastic, as if trying to compensate for my mother's criticism. And with each dress, I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter, the joy of the moment bleeding away. Then Melissa arrived. I hadn't known she was coming. My mother had apparently invited her without telling me, and Melissa swept into the boutique with her friend Tara, both of them wearing designer jeans and looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Melissa kissed my mother's cheek and settled onto the couch, like she was the one getting married. Oh, good. We haven't missed anything important, Melissa said brightly. What are we thinking for dresses? We're still looking, my mother said with a sigh. It's challenging. I was in the fitting room, trying on the 6th dress when I heard them. The dress was actually beautiful, off-white with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that made me feel for just a moment like maybe I could be the kind of bride who belonged in magazines. I smoothed down the fabric and opened the fitting room door. Marie's face lit up. That's the one, she said softly. You look absolutely radiant. I turned to look at myself in the 3-way mirror. The dress fit perfectly, skimming my curves without clinging the lace, catching the boutique's soft lighting. For a moment, I saw what Marie saw, not someone trying to hide or minimize herself, but someone who looked happy and hopeful and, yes, beautiful. Then I heard Melissa's voice. Not quite a whisper, pitched just loud enough to carry across the room. Look at her, she said to Tara, and there was laughter in her voice, cruel and dismissive. She looks like a fat pig in a wedding dress. Tara giggled, a sound that cut through the soft music playing in the boutique. My mother said nothing, didn't tell Melissa to stop, didn't defend me, didn't even look uncomfortable. She just took another sip of champagne and studied her phone. I stood there frozen, staring at my reflection. The beautiful dress suddenly felt like a costume, like I was a child playing dress-up in clothes that didn't belong to her. I could feel tears building behind my eyes, hot and insistent, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them. Marie had gone very still beside me. When I glanced at her, I saw sympathy in her face, maybe even anger on my behalf, but she said nothing. What could she say? This was a family matter, private and painful, and she was just the consultant trying to sell a dress. "I need a moment," I said quietly and retreated back into the fitting room. I stood there with my back against the door, my hands shaking as I gripped the delicate lace. I could hear them outside, my mother's voice discussing alterations with Melissa's laughter, as she showed Tara something on her phone, the casual cruelty of people who didn't even realise they'd drawn blood because they'd never seen me as someone who could bleed. 34 years. 34 years of this, of being the punchline to jokes I never understood, of being dismissed and diminished and told in 1,000 subtle and not so subtle ways that I wasn't enough. And now, standing in a wedding dress that should have been a symbol of joy and new beginnings, all I could hear was my sister's voice calling me a fat pig. I looked at myself in the fitting room mirror, really looked. Saw the curve of my body in expensive lace, saw the red rims around my eyes from holding back tears, saw a woman who was so tired of being invisible that she'd convinced herself being seen would fix everything. But being seen by Daniel hadn't changed anything, had it? Not with them. They still saw what they'd always seen, or maybe they still refused to see anything at all. I was standing there, staring at my reflection and fighting back tears when the fitting room door opened and Daniel walked in. "Kelly." His voice was soft concerned. He must have seen my face because he immediately stepped inside and closed the door behind him, giving us privacy. "Marie texted me. She said you might need me." That's all it took. The kindness in his voice, the fact that a near stranger had cared enough to reach out to him, the contrast between Marie's silent sympathy and my own family's casual cruelty. The tears I'd been fighting broke free, and suddenly I was sobbing, really sobbing, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep and buried and long ignored. Daniel pulled me into his arms without hesitation, and I let myself collapse against him, my careful composure finally completely shattered. The wedding dress crushed between us, delicate lace pressing into expensive suit fabric, and I didn't care about any of it. I just cried into his chest while he held me, one hand in my hair, the other steady against my back. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Tell me what happened." And I did. Standing there in that fitting room, still wearing the dress that was supposed to make me feel beautiful, I told him everything. Not just about today, about Melissa's comment and my mother's silence, but about all of it. 34 years of being the invisible daughter, the family embarrassment, the one who was never quite right. I told him about being 6 years old and overhearing my mother tell a friend that she wished I'd try harder to be more like other girls. About being 12 and having Melissa's friends ask if we were really sisters, because we looked nothing alike. The implication being that one of us was pretty and one of us wasn't. About being 16 and my father forgetting my birthday, but throwing Melissa an elaborate Sweet 16 party 3 months later. About every small, slight and quiet dismissal that had taught me over and over that my worth was conditional and my presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. "They've never seen me," I said, my voice breaking. "Not once. And the worst part is, I kept hoping they would. I kept thinking if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, became successful enough, then maybe they'd notice. But it doesn't matter what I do. To them, I'll always be not good enough." Daniel's arms tightened around me. When I finally looked up at him, I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Anger. Not at me, but for me. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "My whole life." "And today, what did they say today?" I hesitated, but he deserved the truth. "Melissa called me a fat pig in a wedding dress. My mother heard her. She didn't say anything." Daniel went very still. Then he stepped back slightly, his hands moving to my shoulders, and looked at me directly. "Kelly, listen to me. You are brilliant. You are beautiful. You saved my company. You saved my future, and you did it with more grace and competence than anyone I've ever worked with. The fact that your family can't see that says everything about them and nothing about you." But they're my family, I whispered. They're supposed to see me. Then I think it's time they knew exactly who you are, Daniel said, and there was something fierce in his voice now, protective and angry and absolutely certain. Not the version of you they have decided to see, the real you, the woman who's smarter than anyone in that room out there, the woman who owns 51% of a multi-million-dollar company, the woman who's about to be my wife. Something shifted inside me as he spoke. Some internal switch that had been stuck in the off position for 34 years suddenly flipped to on. I'd spent my entire life trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable, hoping that if I took up less space, maybe they'd make room for me anyway. But they never had. And they never would. Because the problem wasn't that I was too much. The problem was that they couldn't see enough. I'm done, I said quietly, and the words felt like a door closing. Or maybe like a door opening. I'm done being silent. I'm done shrinking myself to fit into their idea of who I should be. Daniel smiled, and it was proud and fierce. There she is. But how? I asked. How do I make them see? You don't make them do anything, Daniel said. You just stop hiding. You stop keeping your success secret because you're afraid of making them uncomfortable. You stop protecting them from the truth of who you've become. He paused. And you let me help you. I searched his face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, he said slowly, that our wedding is in 3 weeks. And I'm thinking that everyone who matters to you will be there, including your family. His expression turned calculating strategic, the same look he got when he was solving a complex business problem. Trust me. With my life. I said and meant it. Then let me handle this. Let me show them who you really are in a way they can't ignore or dismiss or explain away. I looked at myself in the fitting room mirror again. Same dress, same face, same body. But something was different now. I stood differently. My spine was straighter. My eyes were clearer. For the first time in my life, I looked at my reflection and didn't see all the ways I failed to measure up. I just saw myself, and that was enough. Okay, I said, show them. 3 weeks later, on a warm July evening, I walked down the aisle in the dress Melissa had mocked. The ceremony was simple and perfect, held in a garden overlooking the harbour. When Daniel and I exchanged vows, I looked only at him, not at my family sitting in the third row, not at Melissa, who was watching with an expression I couldn't read. At the reception, we danced and laughed and celebrated with the people who actually loved us. My family sat at their assigned table, looking vaguely uncomfortable, my mother making small talk with Daniel's parents, my father checking his phone, Melissa picking at her food. Then, halfway through dinner, Daniel stood up and walked to where the band had set up. He took the microphone from the singer, and the room gradually quieted. I felt my heart start to race, though I didn't know yet what he was going to say. Before we continue, Daniel said, his voice carrying across the reception, there's something everyone here needs to know about my wife. The reception hall went quiet. All conversation stopped mid-sentence. Folks paused halfway to mouth champagne glasses held suspended in air. Daniel stood at the front of the room, with the microphone looking confident and calm, and I sat frozen at our table, my heart hammering against my ribs. I want to tell you all a story. Daniel continued, his voice warm, but carrying an edge of something serious. 6 months ago, my company was dying. We were months away from bankruptcy, from having to lay off 200 employees, from losing everything I'd built over 15 years. I was desperate, and I needed help from someone brilliant enough to see solutions no one else could find. He paused, and his eyes found mine across the room. So I called Kelly. I could feel every eye in the room turn toward me. My cheeks flushed, but I kept my head up, kept my expression steady. Kelly spent 3 weeks analysing our financials, Daniel said. She worked 16-hour days. She restructured our entire portfolio, negotiated with creditors, brought in new investors, and saved my company from total collapse. She did, in 3 weeks, what 3 different consulting firms couldn't do in 6 months. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. But here's what most of you don't know. When I tried to pay her what she was worth, she refused. She said her consulting fee was enough, so I did what any smart businessman would do. I gave her equity instead. I saw my mother's head tilt slightly, confusion crossing her face. My father leaned forward in his seat. Melissa's expression was unreadable, frozen, somewhere between curiosity and apprehension. Those papers Kelly signed back in March, Daniel continued, weren't symbolic. They weren't a gesture or a token of appreciation. They were a legal transfer of 51% voting shares in Millennium Holdings. He let that sink in for a moment. The shares vested over 12 months, and as of 2 weeks ago, that vesting period is complete. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. What I'm telling you, Daniel said, his voice clear and proud, is that Kelly Hughes, Kelly Miller, now is the majority owner of Millennium Holdings. She's not my employee. She's not my consultant. She's my business partner and the single largest shareholder in a company currently valued at $48 million. She owns it, she controls it, and she's the reason it still exists. The sound that broke the silence was my mother's fork hitting her plate. The clatter was loud and sharp, echoing through the reception hall like a gunshot. I turned to look at my family's table and saw my mother's face pale and shocked, her mouth slightly open. My father looked like someone had just explained a magic trick and he couldn't quite process how it had been done. And Melissa's face had drained of all colour. She was staring at me with an expression of pure, undiluted disbelief. Kelly didn't tell most of you about this, Daniel continued, because that's who she is. She doesn't brag. She doesn't need validation. She just does extraordinary work and moves on to the next thing. But I think it's time everyone knew what I know, that my wife is one of the most brilliant financial minds I've ever encountered, and I'm lucky she chose to save my company. I'm even luckier she chose to marry me. The room erupted. Not in applause at first, but in a wave of shocked, murmuring people, turning to their neighbours' voices rising in surprise and speculation. Then someone started clapping Daniel's father, standing up at his table, with tears in his eyes, and suddenly everyone was applauding, standing in the sound building and building until it filled the entire space. Everyone except my family. My mother sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. My father's face had gone from confused to calculating, his mind clearly racing through implications. And Melissa just stared at me with something that looked like hatred. Daniel walked over to our table and extended his hand to me. I stood up, my legs shaky, but holding, and took his hand. He pulled me close and kissed me in front of everyone, and when we broke apart, he whispered in my ear, "Now they know." The rest of the reception passed in a blur. People kept coming up to congratulate me, to ask about my work, to treat me with a respect I'd never experienced from anyone except Daniel. Business contacts of Daniel's asked for my card. His mother hugged me and told me she'd known I was special the moment they met. His father pulled me aside and said, "You saved our son's life's work. Thank you." My own family stayed at their table. They didn't approach me. They didn't congratulate me. They sat in their corner of the room, speaking quietly to each other occasionally, glancing in my direction with expressions I couldn't quite read. It wasn't until later, when Daniel and I were cutting the cake, that I saw Melissa stand up and excuse herself from the table. She walked past me on her way to the restroom, and as she did, she leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "Enjoy this," she whispered, her voice like ice, "while it lasts." Then she was gone, disappeared into the crowd, and I was left standing there with the knife in my hand and a sick feeling in my stomach. I looked across the room and caught my mother's eye. She was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between respect and resentment, pride and anger, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the daughter she'd always known with the woman Daniel had just described. But it was Melissa's face I couldn't forget, even as the night went on, even as Daniel and I danced and laughed and celebrated. That look she'd given me as she walked past, cold and calculating and dangerous. As guests whispered in shock around us, as my mother continued to sit in stunned silence, I saw something dangerous flash across Melissa's face. When she returned to the table, a look that said, "This wasn't over." The days following the wedding were surreal. My phone rang constantly, with calls from business journalists wanting interviews from professional organisations, inviting me to speak from other companies, asking if I took on consulting work. The world had suddenly noticed me, and while part of me felt vindicated, another part felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. Daniel and I had postponed our honeymoon planning to take it in the fall when things settled down. Instead, we spent those first weeks of marriage working side by side at Millennium Holdings, with me gradually taking on a more active role in the company's strategic decisions. It felt right natural, like I'd finally found the place I was meant to be. My mother called once, 3 days after the wedding. The conversation was stiff and awkward, full of long pauses and careful words. She congratulated me on my success, asked perfunctory questions about married life, and then said she had to go. She didn't apologise. She didn't acknowledge the years of dismissal or the cruelty at the dress fitting. She just acted as if none of it had happened, as if we could simply reset and pretend the past didn't exist. My father sent a text, "Proud of you, Kelly. Impressive accomplishment." And Melissa said nothing at all. Radio silence, no call, no text, no acknowledgement that we'd just attended the same wedding where her entire perception of me had been fundamentally challenged, until 10 days after the wedding when she showed up at my office. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant buzzed me. "Your sister is here to see you. She says it's important." I felt my stomach tighten, but I told her to send Melissa in. She entered wearing a pale pink dress and carrying an expensive handbag, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile bright and warm in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Kelly," she said, crossing the office to hug me. "I'm so sorry I haven't reached out sooner. Things have been crazy." I returned the hug stiffly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I've been thinking a lot about what Daniel said at your wedding." Melissa continued, settling into the chair across from my desk. "About everything you've accomplished. And I realised I've been a terrible sister. I've been jealous and petty, and I'm ashamed of how I've treated you." The words sounded practiced, rehearsed. I studied her face, looking for sincerity, but all I saw was that same bright, performative warmth she used with everyone. "Okay," I said carefully. "I appreciate you saying that." "I want to help," Melissa said, leaning forward earnestly. "You're going to be in the public eye now, Kelly. People are going to want to know about you, write about you. Your image matters. And I will work in marketing. This is what I do. Let me help you manage your public presence. Consider it my way of making amends." Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap, that Melissa didn't do anything without an angle. But another part of me, the part that had spent 34 years hoping my sister might someday actually care about me, wanted to believe her. "I don't know if that's necessary," I said. "I'm not looking to be famous. I just want to do good work." "Which is exactly why you need help," Melissa insisted. "You don't understand how the media works, how quickly they can turn on you if you're not careful. Let me at least consult with you. Give me a chance to prove I've changed." I should have said no. I should have trusted my instincts. But I was tired of fighting with my family, tired of the constant tension and hostility. If there was even a chance that Melissa genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, didn't I owe it to both of us to try? "Okay," I said finally. "We can try working together. But Melissa, if this is some kind of game..." "It's not," she said quickly, reaching across the desk to squeeze my hand. "I promise, Kelly, I'm done competing with you. I just want us to be sisters again." She left 20 minutes later with access to my calendar, and a promise to send over some preliminary PR strategy documents. I sat at my desk feeling unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that I just made a terrible mistake. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Melissa left my office and drove directly to the Seaport District, to a sleek high-rise that housed the offices of Grant Investments. Mr. Richard Grant was a man in his late 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of controlled anger that comes from years of losing to better competitors. 6 months earlier, Millennium Holdings had outbid Grant Investments for a major client, a tech company worth hundreds of millions in potential fees. It was the third time in 2 years that Daniel had beaten Grant to a lucrative deal, and the resentment had festered into something darker. When Melissa walked into his office that afternoon, she came with a proposition. Grant had done his research after the wedding announcement made the business news. He knew exactly who Melissa was, knew the family dynamics, could read between the lines of every society page mention. And when she sat across from him and said, "I think we can help each other," he listened. "My sister has something that should have been mine." Melissa said, her voice cold and precise, all pretense of sisterly warmth gone. "And you want to destroy the company that keeps humiliating you. I can give you what you need to make that happen." "What exactly are you proposing?" Grant asked. "Access," Melissa said simply. "I'm going to be consulting on Kelly's public image, which means I'll have access to her calendar, her contacts, her priorities. I can tell you when she's vulnerable, when the company's vulnerable. I can feed you information that will let you strike at exactly the right moment." "And what do you want in return?" "When Millennium Holdings falls," Melissa said, "I want compensation, wealth, status, the things that should have been mine if Kelly hadn't stolen them." Grant smiled thin and calculating. "I think we can work together, Ms. Hughes." They shook hands, two people united by bitterness and jealousy, and began plotting the destruction of everything I'd built. But I knew none of this. I went home that night and told Daniel about Melissa's visit, about her offer to help with PR. He'd frowned and said, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" But I'd convinced him and myself that maybe this was a chance for healing, for finally having the sister relationship I'd always wanted. 6 weeks later, in early September, I woke up to my phone exploding with notifications and a news headline that made my blood run cold. The headline screamed across my phone screen in bold letters, "Millennium Holdings CEO accused of systematic financial fraud. Evidence points to recent restructuring." My hands started shaking before I'd even finished reading the first paragraph. The article, published by the Boston Business Journal at 6 a.m, alleged that the financial restructuring I'd implemented 6 months ago had involved fraudulent accounting practices, falsified investor reports, and deliberate misrepresentation of the company's assets. Anonymous sources claimed to have documents proving that Millennium Holdings' recovery was built on lies, that the stability we'd achieved was an illusion created through illegal manipulation of financial records. My phone rang. Daniel. His voice was tight with controlled panic. "Tell me you're seeing this," he said. "I'm looking at it right now." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. "Daniel, none of this is true. Every single thing I did was legitimate, transparent, completely by the book." "I know that," he said immediately. "But Kelly, this is bad. Really bad. I'm getting calls from board members, from investors. The SEC is going to have to investigate. We need to get ahead of this right now." By 7 a.m. I was in the office. By 8, the board had called an emergency meeting. I sat at the conference table surrounded by 12 men and women who'd praised my work just weeks ago, and now they looked at me with suspicion and barely concealed alarm. Patricia, the CFO, who'd called my restructuring brilliant, cleared her throat. "Kelly, I need to ask you directly. Is there any truth to these allegations?" "None," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "Every decision I made was vetted by our legal team and our auditors. Every document was filed properly with the appropriate regulatory bodies. This is a complete fabrication." "Then where did these accusations come from?" asked Robert Chen, the board member who'd helped structure my equity agreement. The article claims to have documentation, bank records, internal memos. I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, we'd agreed on a strategy to hire an independent forensic accounting firm to review everything I'd done, cooperate fully with the SEC investigation that would inevitably follow, and issue a public statement denying the allegations. But there was one more decision that needed to be made. Kelly, Patricia said gently, I think you should consider stepping aside temporarily, just until this is resolved. The words hit like a physical blow. Step aside. Not permanently, she said quickly, just as a gesture of good faith to show we're taking this seriously, that we're committed to transparency. You'd retain your ownership shares, obviously, but Daniel would resume full operational control until the investigation concludes. I looked at Daniel, who was sitting beside me with his jaw clenched. He gave me a small nod. This was the smart play, the strategic move. Fighting it would only make me look guilty. I'll step aside voluntarily, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, until my name is cleared completely. The press conference that afternoon was a nightmare. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. My carefully prepared statement drowned out by accusations and speculation. I stood at the podium in a navy suit, my hands gripping the edges of the wood to keep them from shaking, and said all the right things about transparency and cooperation and confidence in the truth. But I could see it in their faces. They'd already decided I was guilty. The narrative was too good, too dramatic. Woman gets sudden power, woman corrupts that power through fraud. It fit every stereotype about ambition and greed and women who wanted too much. By evening, my phone was flooded with messages. Some supportive, many not. Business contacts I'd met at conferences suddenly couldn't remember having spoken to me. Interview requests that had been in the works were quietly cancelled. The professional reputation I'd built over a decade was crumbling in real time. And then Melissa showed up at my door. She was carrying flowers and wearing an expression of concern that looked almost genuine. Kelly, oh my God, I came as soon as I saw the news. Are you okay? I let her in because I was too exhausted to do anything else. She set the flowers on my kitchen counter and pulled me into a hug that I didn't return. This is insane, she said, stepping back to look at me with wide, sympathetic eyes. I can't believe someone would do this to you. Make up these horrible lies. They're not just lies, I said numbly. Someone fabricated evidence, documents. This was planned. Who would do that? Melissa asked, and her performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed she actually cared. Who would want to hurt you like this? I don't know. I sank onto the couch, suddenly too tired to stand. But I'm going to find out. Melissa sat beside me, taking my hand. I believe in you, sis. I know you'd never do this. You're the most honest person I know. She paused. Is there anything I can do? Any way I can help? No, I said, but thank you for being here. She stayed for another hour, saying all the right things, playing the role of a supportive sister with an expertise that should have made me suspicious. But I was too deep in shock, too overwhelmed by watching my life implode to question her sincerity. After she left, Daniel came home from a late meeting with our lawyers. He found me sitting in the dark living room, staring at nothing. Talk to me, he said, sitting beside me and pulling me close. What if we can't prove I'm innocent? I whispered. What if whoever did this was good enough that we can't find the truth? We'll find it, Daniel said with absolute certainty. I promise you, Kelly. We will find out who did this and why. While I maintained a calm exterior in the days that followed, going through the motions of cooperating with investigators and meeting with lawyers, Daniel was already digging. He hired a private investigation firm. He brought in cybersecurity experts to trace the source of the leaked documents. He worked late into the night, driven by a fury I'd never seen in him before, and what he found 3 weeks later made him go pale. Daniel came home at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. I was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing legal documents, for the 100th time searching for any angle we might have missed. When I heard his key in the lock, I looked up and saw his face, pale, drawn, and carrying an expression I couldn't quite identify. Anger, yes, but also something like grief. "You found something?" I said. It wasn't a question. He set his briefcase down, carefully, deliberately, like someone buying time before delivering terrible news. Then he crossed to the table and opened his laptop, angling it so I could see the screen. "The cybersecurity team traced the source of the leaked documents," he said quietly. "It took them 3 weeks, because whoever did this was careful routing everything through multiple proxies and encrypted servers, but they found it." He pulled up a technical report filled with IP addresses and timestamps and digital fingerprints that meant nothing to me. But then he scrolled to the bottom to a section highlighted in yellow. "The documents were sent to the Boston Business Journal from an email account registered under a false name," Daniel continued. "But the IP address traces back to a coffee shop in the South End. The same coffee shop where the login occurred at least 15 times over the past 2 months, always from the same device." He paused. "We got the MAC address of that device. It belongs to Melissa's laptop." The words didn't register at first. I stared at the screen, at the incomprehensible strings of numbers and letters, and my brain simply refused to process what he was telling me. "That can't be right," I said finally. "Melissa wouldn't. She's been supporting me through this. She's been here almost every other day bringing food, helping me cope with..." "Kelly." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. He pulled up another window, this one showing email records. "We also found correspondence between Melissa's personal email and someone named Richard Grant. Do you know that name?" I did. Richard Grant ran Grant Investments, one of Millennium Holdings' main competitors. Daniel had outbid him for several major clients over the past 2 years. "He's your rival," I said slowly. "The one who lost that tech company contract to us." "He's more than a rival now," Daniel said. "He's the one who orchestrated this entire thing, and Melissa helped him." He showed me the emails, months of correspondence, starting just days after our wedding. Melissa feeding Grant information about my schedule, about company vulnerabilities, about internal strategies. Grant promising her compensation status, a position at his firm, once Millennium Holdings collapsed. I read the emails twice, then a third time, and with each pass, something inside me broke and rebuilt itself harder. The shock gave way to a cold, clarifying fury. "She's been playing me this entire time," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Every visit, every sympathetic word, every moment of fake sisterly concern. She's been here watching me suffer from something she caused." "I'm so sorry," Daniel said, reaching for my hand. "I know this is..." "Don't," I interrupted, pulling my hand back, not because I was angry at him, but because if he touched me with kindness right now, I would shatter, and I couldn't afford to shatter. Not yet. We need to think strategically. "What do we do with this information?" Daniel looked at me carefully, as if assessing whether I was truly okay or just in shock. "We take it to the SEC, to our lawyers, to the police. This is conspiracy, fraud, industrial espionage. Melissa and Grant could face serious criminal charges." "No," I said. The word came out sharp and definitive. "Not yet. Kelly, think about it." I said, my mind already racing ahead, clicking through possibilities like I was solving a financial puzzle. "We have evidence that Melissa had opportunity and means, but what we don't have is undeniable proof of intent. A good lawyer could argue her laptop was hacked, that the emails were fabricated, that someone set her up just like they set me up. We need her to prove her own guilt in a way she can't explain away." Daniel sat back, studying me. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," I said slowly, "that Melissa believes she's winning. She thinks I'm broken, that I'm desperate and isolated. And desperate people make mistakes." I opened my own laptop and started typing. What if I gave her exactly what she wants? What if I invited her to become a formal partner in rebuilding my reputation and my career? "You want to bring her in closer?" Daniel asked, incredulous. I want her to commit, I said. In writing, on record, with her signature and her explicit agreement to terms that proved she knew about the fraud allegations and deliberately positioned herself to profit from my downfall. My fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting a partnership agreement that looked legitimate on the surface, but was actually a carefully constructed trap. If she signs this acknowledging specific details about the scandal and her role in helping me recover from it, she's creating evidence of her own guilty knowledge. Daniel read over my shoulder as I typed. Slowly, his expression changed from concern to something that looked like reluctant admiration. This is risky. If she suspects anything, she won't, I said with certainty I didn't entirely feel. She thinks I'm weak. She's spent 34 years watching me absorb cruelty without fighting back. She has no idea that I know how to fight. I've just never had a reason to before. We spent the next 3 hours perfecting the document. A partnership agreement that positioned Melissa as my brand rehabilitation consultant, with specific compensation tied to my recovery from the recent allegations of financial misconduct. Language that required her to acknowledge detailed knowledge of the scandal's specifics far more than what had been publicly reported. Clauses that would be meaningless in a legitimate contract, but would be damning evidence if compared against the timeline of events. The next morning I called Melissa. My voice was shaky, not entirely an act given I'd barely slept and defeated. Melissa, can you come over? I need to talk to you about something important. She arrived within an hour wearing concern like a carefully tailored outfit. I met her at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling smile. Thank you for coming, I said, ushering her inside. I've been thinking a lot about what you said about rebuilding my image and moving forward. I can't do this alone. I need someone I can trust, and despite everything that's happened between us over the years, you're still my sister. Melissa's expression softened into something that might have looked like genuine emotion if I didn't know better. Of course, Kelly. I told you I'm here for you. I want to make it official, I said, sliding the partnership agreement across the kitchen table. I want you to be my formal partner in rehabilitating my reputation. There's compensation involved, equity even once this is all resolved. But I need to know you're committed, that you believe in me. Melissa picked up the document, her eyes scanning the pages. I watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of suspicion, any hesitation. But all I saw was barely concealed triumph. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd finally gotten what she deserved, a piece of my success, my company, my life. This is generous, she said, and I heard the calculation in her voice. She was already thinking about how much she could get, how thoroughly she could leverage this position. You're my sister, I said simply. And, after everything, I just want us to finally work together instead of against each other. Melissa signed on the last page with a flourish, her signature bold and confident. When she looked up, she was smiling a real smile, sharp with satisfaction. I won't let you down, she said, and the irony of those words almost made me laugh. When Melissa signed that contract with a triumphant smile, she had no idea she'd just handed me the evidence I needed to prove everything. I sent the dinner invitation 4 days after Melissa signed the contract. A simple text to my mother. I'd like the family to come to dinner this Saturday. There's something important I need to discuss with all of you. My mother responded within minutes, her message carrying the barely concealed relief of someone who thought I was finally coming to my senses, ready to admit defeat and beg for support. Daniel and I spent Saturday afternoon preparing. Not just the meal, though. I'd ordered catering from a restaurant my mother loved, but the staging. 2 manila folders placed carefully in the study just out of sight. My laptop positioned on the sideboard, already open to the relevant files. Everything calculated, everything deliberate. My parents arrived first, my mother carrying a bottle of wine and an expression of maternal concern that might have been genuine if I hadn't spent the past 2 months watching my life crumble, while she offered nothing but distant sympathy. My father looked uncomfortable the way he always did when forced into emotionally complex situations. "Kelly, sweetheart," my mother said, embracing me briefly. "Thank you for inviting us. We've been so worried about you." "I appreciate that," I said neutrally, taking their coats. Melissa arrived 20 minutes late wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She swept into our home with the confidence of someone who believed she'd already won, who thought tonight was her victory lap. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced warmth. Traffic was a nightmare. We gathered in the dining room around the table Daniel and I had carefully set. My mother complimented the flowers. My father made small talk about the weather. Melissa smiled and sipped her wine, her eyes flickering around the room with barely concealed satisfaction. We made it through the first course, a butternut squash soup, with surface-level conversation. My mother asked about the CC investigation, with the careful delicacy of someone asking about a terminal illness. My father mentioned that business could be unpredictable. Melissa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "It's going to be okay, sis," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "These things blow over eventually, and you have me helping you now. We're a team." That's when I stood up. "Actually," I said, my voice calm and clear, "that's what I wanted to talk to you all about." I walked to the sideboard and picked up the 2 manila folders. My hands were steady. My heart was pounding, but my voice remained level as I returned to the table and placed the folders in the centre between the soup bowls and the wine glasses. "I asked you here tonight because there's something you need to know about what happened to me, about who's responsible for destroying my reputation and trying to destroy my company." My mother's face creased with concern. "Kelly, if this is about the allegations..." "It's about the truth," I interrupted. "The truth about where those allegations came from and who created them." Melissa's smile had frozen on her face, but her eyes were alert now, watchful. She'd started to realise this wasn't the conversation she'd expected. I opened the first folder and removed the forensic investigation report, placing it on the table where everyone could see. 3 weeks ago, Daniel hired a cybersecurity firm to trace the source of the leaked documents that started the scandal. They found that every single falsified document was sent from a specific device, always from the same coffee shop in the South End. My father leaned forward, studying the report. I watched his face as he read, watched comprehension dawn, slowly watched him go pale. "The device belonged to Melissa," I said quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. My father's eyes moved from the report to Melissa's face. And Melissa's carefully maintained expression of concern finally cracked. "That's ridiculous," she said, but her voice had lost its confidence. "Kelly, are you seriously accusing me of..." "I'm not accusing you," I said. "I'm telling you what the evidence proves." I opened the second folder, removing printed copies of the emails between Melissa and Richard Grant. "These are communications between you and Grant Investments spanning from July to September. You fed him proprietary information about Millennium Holdings. You told him when I'd be vulnerable. And you helped him fabricate evidence to destroy my reputation." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She was staring at Melissa with an expression I'd never seen before, complete bewilderment mixed with dawning horror. "Melissa," my father said, his voice strained. "Tell me this isn't true." "She's lying," Melissa said, but there was desperation in her voice now. "She's making this up because she can't handle that her own incompetence caused the scandal." "Kelly, how dare you try to blame me for your failures? I'm not done," I said, and something in my tone made Melissa stop talking. I reached into the second folder and pulled out the partnership agreement she'd signed just a week ago. "This is the contract you signed, Melissa. The one where you agreed to help me recover from the recent allegations of financial misconduct. Except here's the interesting part." I flipped to page 3 where I'd highlighted specific paragraphs in yellow. "This contract requires you to acknowledge detailed knowledge of allegations that were never made public. specific accounts that were supposedly falsified, exact dates of supposed fraudulent transactions, information that only someone involved in creating the false allegations would know. My father took the contract with shaking hands and began reading. I watched his face change as he understood what he was seeing. "You signed this," he said to Melissa, his voice hollow. "You acknowledged all of this. You could never beat me, sis," Melissa had said when she arrived, her words sharp with confidence. "You never had the spine." But now, sitting across from me with the evidence of her betrayal spread across the table, that confidence had evaporated entirely. My mother was staring at Melissa like she was looking at a stranger. "Tell me Kelly's wrong," she said. "Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." Melissa's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could she say? The evidence was irrefutable. I looked at Melissa and said quietly, "Your signature on this contract proves you knew about the fraud. The IP logs prove you created it." The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Melissa sat, frozen, her face drained of colour, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. My father was still holding the contract, his eyes moving over the words again and again, as if hoping they'd say something different. My mother looked like she might be sick. "There's more," I said, and I pulled out my phone. The investigative firm also obtained phone records. Some of Melissa's calls to Grant were recorded by his office's automated system, standard procedure for a business line. I connected my phone to the Bluetooth speaker on the sideboard. "I'm going to play one of them for you now." My finger hovered over the play button, giving Melissa one last chance to confess, to explain, and to show even a shred of remorse. But she just stared at me with something that looked like hatred mixed with desperation. I pressed play. Grant's voice came through the speaker first, crisp and businesslike. "So you're certain about the timeline we need to strike while she's most vulnerable?" Then Melissa's voice, and hearing it was like being stabbed, not because it sounded different from her usual warm, performative tone, but because it sounded exactly the same. Bright, confident, pleased with herself. "Absolutely certain. Kelly's presenting at the industry conference next week. That's when we release everything. Maximum exposure, maximum damage. She'll be standing in front of 500 people when the news breaks." A pause, then a laugh. "I can't wait to see her face." "And you're sure she won't trace this back to you?" "She won't. Kelly's brilliant with numbers, but she's naive about people. She still thinks I actually care about helping her. It's pathetic, really. She's spent her whole life begging for scraps of approval from this family, and she still hasn't figured out that some of us just aren't worth the effort." The recording ended. In the silence that followed, I could hear my mother's breathing rapid and shallow, like she was trying not to hyperventilate. "Melissa," my father said, and his voice cracked on her name. "How could you—" That's when Melissa finally broke. The carefully maintained facade shattered completely, and she dissolved into tears. Not delicate, pretty crying, but the ugly, desperate kind that comes from being caught with no way out. "You don't understand," she sobbed, looking at my mother with wild, pleading eyes. "None of you understand what it's been like. My entire life I've had to be perfect. I've had to be beautiful and charming and successful because that was the only way to keep Mum's attention. And then, Kelly." She turned to me, her face twisted with anguish. "You weren't even trying, and suddenly everyone was talking about how brilliant you were, how impressive. At the wedding, people I'd known for years looked at you like you were someone special, like you mattered more than me." "So you tried to destroy me," I said quietly. "I just wanted Mum to love me the way she never loved you." Melissa screamed, and the words hung in the air like an accusation. "She always loved you more even when she pretended not to. I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at you, this guilt, this obligation. I had to be perfect to get even half of what you got without trying. And then You went and became this successful CEO, and I realised I'd spent my entire life competing for second place. My mother had gone absolutely still, her face frozen in an expression of dawning horror. Melissa, that's not... I never... Yes, you did, Melissa said, her voice breaking. You loved her first. She was always first. And I was just the consolation prize, the daughter you had after you'd already chosen her. The words made no sense, but there was something in the way my mother's face crumpled that told me Melissa had struck at a truth I didn't understand. My father was looking between them with an expression of deep, profound sadness. I felt like I was watching something private, something that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with me all at once. The complexity of it was dizzying. My sister had betrayed me out of jealousy, but that jealousy came from feeling unloved, and that feeling came from something I didn't even know existed. But underneath all of that, underneath the explanations and the emotional complexity, was a simple truth. Love isn't built on destroying someone else, Melissa, I said, and my voice was steady even though my hands were shaking. That's not love. That's fear. And what you did to me wasn't about love at all. It was about power and control, and making yourself feel bigger by making me smaller. Melissa looked at me with tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. Kelly, I'm so sorry. I didn't realise how far it would go. Grant promised it would just damage your reputation a little, just enough to level the playing field. I didn't know he'd fabricate criminal allegations. I didn't know it would get this bad. But you knew it would hurt me, I said. And you did it anyway. She had no answer for that. None of them did. I stood up from the table, suddenly exhausted, drained of the righteous anger that had carried me through this confrontation. All I felt now was empty and sad and tired of caring about people who would never care about me the same way. I'm going to turn all of this evidence over to the SEC and to the police, I said. They'll decide what charges to file against you and Grant. I'm done protecting people who won't protect me. I turned to walk away to leave them sitting with the wreckage of their lies and betrayals, but my mother's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, desperate. Kelly, wait, she said, her voice thick with tears. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have said 28 years ago. I stood frozen, my mother's fingers wrapped around my wrist. Everyone at the table had gone still. Daniel halfway out of his chair, my father with his head in his hands. Melissa staring at my mother with red, swollen eyes. Mom, I can't do this right now, I said, my voice strained. Whatever you need to say, it can wait. No, my mother said, and there was a finality in her voice I'd never heard before. It can't wait. If you walk out that door without knowing the truth, I'll never forgive myself. She released my wrist but held my gaze. Please, give me 1 hour, just 1 hour alone. Then if you never want to see me again, I'll understand. I looked at Daniel, who gave me a small nod. Whatever this was, he seemed to think I needed to hear it. 1 hour, I said. My mother asked if we could go to my study. My father and Melissa stayed at the dining table, and Daniel excused himself to the living room, giving us privacy. I led my mother down the hall, my heart pounding with an anxiety I couldn't name. We sat in the leather chairs by the window, the city lights of Boston spread out below us. My mother's hands were shaking as she folded them in her lap. I don't know how to start this, she said quietly. I've rehearsed it in my head 1,000 times over the years, but now that the moment is here, all those careful words feel inadequate. Just say it, I said. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than what I've already learned tonight. My mother took a deep breath. Kelly, you're not my biological daughter. Your father and I adopted you when you were 6 years old. The words hit me like physical blows. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. 6 years old? I was 6 years old enough to remember. And yet I had no memory of being adopted, no memory of a life before the Hughes family. Your biological mother's name was Sarah Mitchell. My mother continued, her voice trembling. She was 27 when she died in a car accident. You were with her when it happened. You survived with minor injuries, but Sarah died at the scene. She pulled a tissue from her purse, dabbing at her eyes. You had no other family. Your father had died when you were a baby, and Sarah's parents had passed away years before. You went into foster care for 3 months while the state tried to locate any relatives. I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. I don't remember any of this. The social worker said that was common, my mother said. Traumatic amnesia. Your mind protected you by blocking out the memories. When we adopted you, the counsellor told us you might never remember your life before, and that we shouldn't try to force those memories. She looked down at her hands. We probably should have told you when you were older, but your father and I convinced ourselves that if you didn't remember, it was kinder to let you believe you'd always been ours. Melissa was already 4 when you adopted me, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. She was already your daughter, your real daughter. Don't say that, my mother said sharply. You were just as real, just as much our daughter. But I wasn't, I interrupted. Not to you, not really. My voice was rising despite my efforts to control it. That's why, isn't it? That's why you always treated her differently. Why you loved her more. Because she was yours by blood and I was just the girl you took in. It wasn't like that, my mother said, but her face told me I'd struck close to the truth. Kelly, I tried. God, I tried so hard to love you the way I loved Melissa. But you always held yourself apart from me. Even as a little girl, you were so self-contained, so independent. You never needed me the way Melissa did. I was 6 years old, and I'd just lost my mother, I said, my voice breaking. Of course I held myself apart. I was traumatized. I know that now, my mother whispered. But back then, I was young and insecure, and I didn't understand. And I'm ashamed to admit this, but I resented you for it. I resented that you wouldn't let me replace her, that you always seemed to be measuring me against a mother you couldn't even remember and finding me lacking. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. And the worst part is the more distant you were, the more I pulled back. I told myself I was giving you space, but really I was protecting myself from the rejection I felt every time you looked at me like I was a stranger. The cruelty of it took my breath away. A 6-year-old child traumatized and grieving, and the woman who'd adopted her had resented her for not being grateful enough. Do you have any proof? I asked, my voice hollow. Birth certificate, adoption papers. My mother nodded and pulled an envelope from her purse. Her hand shook as she handed it to me. Inside were official documents, an adoption decree dated 28 years ago, a death certificate for Sarah Mitchell, and a letter written in careful flowing handwriting. The letter was addressed to whoever loves my daughter next. I read it with tears blurring my vision. Sarah Mitchell had written it before her death, apparently sensing somehow that she wouldn't be there to raise me. She wrote about hoping I'd have a good life, about wanting me to know I was loved, even if I never remembered her. And at the end, one sentence that broke me completely: please give my daughter the love I couldn't provide. She deserves a family who will see how special she is. I stared at my biological mother's handwriting and whispered, I spent 28 years thinking I wasn't good enough, when the truth was I was never really yours to begin with. I left my mother's house that night and didn't go back. I couldn't. Every time I tried to think about seeing her again, about sitting in that living room where I'd spent 28 years as an outsider, my chest tightened until I couldn't breathe. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. Darker even than when the scandal first broke, because at least then I'd known who I was. I'd been Kelly Hughes, the invisible daughter fighting to prove her worth. Now, I didn't even have that. I wasn't Kelly Hughes. I was Kelly Mitchell, apparently, or maybe I was no one at all. just a ghost of a 6-year-old girl who'd lost her mother and spent the next 28 years trying to earn love from a woman who'd resented her from the start. Daniel found me one December evening, sitting in the dark in our study, staring at nothing. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat down in the chair across from me and waited. "I don't know who I am," I said finally. "If I'm not a Hughes, then who am I? Everything I've been fighting against my whole life, the invisibility, the dismissal, the sense that I never quite belonged. It was all because I actually didn't belong. I was the outsider they brought in and then resented for not being grateful enough." "You're Kelly," Daniel said simply, "the woman I fell in love with, the woman who saved my company and my future, the woman who's brilliant and kind and stronger than anyone I've ever met." "But who is that?" I asked, frustrated. "All my life I've defined myself in relation to them. The daughter who wasn't good enough, the sister who wasn't loved. If I'm not those things, if those relationships were never real to begin with, then what's left?" Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe instead of asking who you are without them, you should ask who you are because of yourself. What do you want, Kelly? Not what would make your mother proud, not what would prove something to Melissa. What do you want for your own life?" I'd never asked myself that question before. It felt revolutionary and terrifying all at once. The next day, I did something I'd been avoiding for 3 years. I went to my storage unit and retrieved the boxes of my adoptive father's things that I'd packed away after he died. I'd been too grief-stricken then to go through them properly, and afterward there'd never seemed to be a good time. But now, I needed to understand something about the man who'd chosen to adopt a traumatized 6-year-old girl. I needed to know if he'd ever truly loved me, or if I'd been a duty to him too. I sat on our living room floor surrounded by boxes, pulling out old photo albums and tax returns and file folders of documents. And then, in a box labelled personal papers, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter dated 6 months before his death, written in the slightly shaky handwriting of someone whose health was already failing. "My dearest Kelly," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment because those 3 words already had me crying. "I'm writing this because I know my time is limited, and there are things I need you to know. Things I should have said while I was alive, but didn't have the courage to say. You are my daughter not by blood but by choice, and that makes you even more precious to me. When your mother and I decided to adopt after what happened to Sarah, we didn't know what we were getting. We didn't know we'd be bringing home a little girl who was so brave, so resilient, so determined to be okay, even when her whole world had shattered." I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to hold back sobs. "I watched you grow up," the letter continued, "and I watched you become the strongest person in this family. You never complained, you never demanded attention, you just quietly, steadily became extraordinary. And I'm ashamed to say I didn't protect you the way I should have. I saw how your mother struggled to connect with you, and I told myself it would get better with time. I saw how Melissa demanded all the attention, and I told myself you didn't need it the same way. I was wrong. You needed parents who would fight for you, and instead you got parents who let you fight alone." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I kept reading. "I want you to know that every success you've achieved, every obstacle you've overcome, every moment you've proven how capable and brilliant you are, I've been proud, so proud. You didn't need us to become who you are. You did that yourself. And that's both the most impressive thing about you and my greatest regret as your father. You shouldn't have had to do it alone." The letter went on for 3 more pages, my father telling me things he'd never said while alive. How he'd known about the tutoring jobs in high school. How he'd suspected I was the one who'd saved the Miller family, but had never asked because he'd figured I had my reasons for keeping it secret. How he'd watched me build my career and wished he'd had the courage to tell me how much he admired me. And then at the bottom of the letter, a postscript that made me go completely still. "P.S. That boy whose family you saved 16 years ago. I always knew it was you. I sat on the floor with my father's letter in my hands for over an hour, reading it again and again, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he'd known and never said. He'd seen me. All those years when I thought I was invisible, he'd been watching, understanding, recognizing who I was, even if he'd lacked the courage to tell me. The grief of that realization was complicated and layered. I mourned for the relationship we could have had if he'd been brave enough to speak these words while he was alive. But I also felt, for the first time since learning I was adopted, a sense of being anchored to something real. Someone in that family had actually loved me. Someone had seen past the awkward dynamics and the resentment and recognized that I mattered. I kept the letter with me constantly over the next few weeks, reading passages. When doubt crept in, when I started to question whether I belonged anywhere. January arrived cold and grey, matching the slow, difficult work of rebuilding myself from the inside out. The SEC investigation concluded in mid-January. With the evidence Daniel and I had provided, the forensic reports, the emails, Melissa's signed contract, they cleared me of all allegations and opened criminal cases against both Melissa and Richard Grant. The business press ran stories about the vindication, about corporate espionage and family betrayal. My lawyer called it a complete victory, but victory felt hollow when it came at the cost of learning your entire childhood had been built on a foundation of lies. I threw myself into work helping Daniel stabilize Millennium Holdings after the tumultuous months of scandal. We spent long hours at the office rebuilding relationships with nervous investors, reassuring clients, proving that the company was solid. It was easier to focus on balance sheets and financial projections than on the complicated wreckage of my personal life. One evening in late January, I was working from home while Daniel was at a late meeting. I needed to access a shared document on his laptop, which was sitting on the desk in our study. I opened it, navigated to our cloud storage, and that's when I saw a folder I didn't recognize. It was labeled simply K Background and dated from last March, right around the time Daniel had first hired me to work on the company crisis. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that even as my cursor hovered over the folder, this was Daniel's private files, his personal research. But something about the date and the vague label made my heart start racing. I clicked. Inside were dozens of documents, background checks, news articles about me from business publications, my LinkedIn profile printed out, records from Boston University, and then, buried deeper, something that made my blood run cold, bank records from 16 years ago showing the trail of money from my high school tutoring jobs to an account labelled Community Scholarship Fund to a payment made to Daniel's mother. He knew. Daniel had known I was the one who saved his family. The folder was dated March, which meant he'd known for almost a year. He'd known when he proposed. He'd known at our wedding. He'd known through all of this, the scandal, the adoption revelation, every intimate conversation we'd had, and he'd never said a word. I heard his key in the door around 9. I was sitting in the study with his laptop still open, the evidence of his investigation glowing on the screen. When he walked in and saw my face, saw what I was looking at, he went very still. "Kelly," he said carefully, "I can explain. Can you?" My voice was eerily calm. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've known for almost a year that I was the one who saved your family when you were 18, and you never thought to mention it." Daniel set down his briefcase and came to sit across from me. He didn't try to close the laptop or make excuses. He just looked at me with an expression that was equal parts guilt and something else I couldn't identify. "You're right," he said. "I've known since 3 weeks after I hired you, and I should have told you." 3 weeks after you hired me," I repeated. "That was almost a year ago, Daniel. We've been married for 6 months. When exactly were you planning to mention this?" "I wasn't," he admitted, and at least he had the decency to look ashamed. "At first, I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure. During the company crisis, you mentioned a specific financial principle, something about restructuring debt through strategic asset reallocation. It was exactly the same approach someone had used to help my family 16 years ago. My father had kept the paperwork from that anonymous scholarship fund, and I remembered the strategy because it was so unusual, so sophisticated for what was supposedly a community program. "So, you investigated me," I said. "I hired a private firm to trace the money," Daniel said. "It took them 2 weeks, but they found it. The trail led back to your high school bank account. You'd opened it specifically for the tutoring income. You were 18 years old, working 3 jobs, and you gave us $5,000. His voice cracked slightly. "You saved my family, Kelly. You saved my father's life, probably. He was on the verge of suicide before that money came through. My mother told me years later that the only thing that kept him alive was knowing someone out there cared enough to help." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but refused to let them fall. "And when you figured out it was me, what then?" "Then I didn't know what to do," Daniel said. "I thought about telling you immediately, but we were in the middle of the crisis. You were working 18-hour days to save the company. It felt wrong to complicate that with this emotional revelation." He ran a hand through his hair. "And then, as we worked together, I started falling for you. Really falling for you. And I was terrified." "Terrified of what?" "That if I told you, I knew you'd think everything between us was built on obligation," Daniel said. "That I was marrying you because I owed you, not because I loved you. That every kind word, every gesture was just repayment for a debt instead of genuine feeling." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Kelly, I fell in love with you before I knew about the scholarship. I fell in love with your mind, your integrity, the way you approached problems with such clarity and precision, the way you saw through all the noise to what actually mattered. That's who I fell in love with. But you still should have told me," I said, my voice breaking. "I know," he said quietly. "You're right, I should have. And I almost did so many times. At the proposal, I almost said it. At the wedding, standing up there making my speech, I wanted to tell everyone what you'd done, but I was afraid of complicating what we had, afraid you'd pull away if you thought I was with you out of gratitude instead of love." I looked at Daniel through tears that were finally spilling over. "You knew for months and said nothing." He took my hands in his, holding them gently. "I fell in love with you before I knew. The knowing just made me love you more." Daniel and I stayed up until 3 a.m. that night talking through everything. His reasons for keeping the secret. My feelings of betrayal, the complicated intersection of gratitude and love, and whether one contaminated the other. By the time we finally went to bed, I understood something I hadn't before, that sometimes people keep secrets. Not out of malice, but out of fear of losing something precious. Daniel had been wrong to hide what he knew, but his motivation had been love, not manipulation. "I forgive you," I told him as we lay in the darkness. "But no more secrets. Ever. I've had enough of those to last a lifetime." "No more secrets," he promised. February arrived with unexpected warmth, the kind of false spring that makes Bostonians briefly forget that winter isn't actually over. I'd been working with a team of lawyers and advisors to establish the Second Chance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting adopted children, foster youth and women who'd faced family rejection or professional sabotage. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was turning my pain into something that might help others avoid the same suffering. We were planning our first fundraising event, a small gallery opening featuring work by artists who'd aged out of foster care, when I received an email that made me pause. It was from Melissa. "Kelly," it read, "I know I have no right to ask anything from you. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I'm asking anyway. I've been watching what you're building with the Second Chance Foundation, and I want to help. I need to help. Please let me volunteer. I need to do something good after all the damage I've caused. Please." I stared at the email for a long time. My first instinct was to delete it to keep Melissa as far from my life as possible. But something about the tone, raw, desperate, lacking her usual performative warmth, made me hesitate. I called Daniel. "Melissa wants to volunteer at the foundation." "Absolutely not," he said immediately. "Kelly, she tried to destroy you. Why would you let her anywhere near something you're building?" "I don't know," I admitted. Maybe because turning her away feels like letting her win in a different way, like she still has power over me. After 2 days of deliberation, I sent a brief reply. "You can volunteer at the gallery event. We'll see how it goes from there." Melissa showed up on the day of the event wearing simple jeans and a black sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. No designer clothes, no careful makeup, none of her usual armour. She looked smaller somehow, diminished with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Thank you for letting me come," she said quietly when she arrived. "Just tell me what you need me to do." I put her to work on the most mundane tasks, setting up chairs, organising name tags, arranging wine glasses. She did everything without complaint, without trying to take control or insert herself into conversations. It was so unlike her usual behaviour that I found myself watching her carefully, looking for the angle, the manipulation. The event was scheduled to start at 7. By 6:30, we had about 40 people milling around the gallery, admiring artwork, making small talk. Melissa was in the corner, carefully arranging programs on a table, when I noticed her sway slightly. "Melissa," I called out, moving toward her. She turned to look at me and I saw her eyes roll back. Then she collapsed her body, hitting the floor before I could reach her. The next 20 minutes were chaos. Someone called 911. I knelt beside Melissa, checking her pulse, making sure she was breathing. Her skin was clammy and pale, her breathing shallow. By the time the ambulance arrived, she'd regained consciousness, but looked disoriented and weak. "I'm fine," she kept saying, trying to sit up. "I just need a minute." "You're going to the hospital," I said firmly, and climbed into the ambulance with her before I could question the decision. At the emergency room, they ran tests while I sat in the waiting area, my phone in my hand, debating whether to call my mother. I decided against it. Whatever this was, I'd handle it first and inform the family later. 2 hours passed before a doctor came out to talk to me. She was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a gentle manner. "Are you family?" she asked. "I'm her sister," I said. The doctor nodded. "Your sister has systemic lupus erythematosus, stage 2 moderate severity. She's been diagnosed for approximately 8 months based on the medication history in her records, but she stopped taking her prescriptions 3 months ago." The doctor's expression was carefully neutral. "She's been in denial, apparently. The collapse was due to a lupus flare triggered by stress and lack of treatment. She's stable now, but she needs to resume medication immediately and commit to regular monitoring." 8 months. Melissa had been diagnosed with lupus last June, right around the time of my wedding. She'd known she was sick while she was plotting with Grant to destroy me. She'd known while she was feeding him information, while she was fabricating evidence, while she was sitting at my dining table and signing that partnership contract. "Can I see her?" I asked. They led me to a curtained area in the ER. Melissa was lying on a hospital bed, an IV in her arm, looking impossibly young and vulnerable in the harsh fluorescent light. When she saw me, tears immediately filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to deal with this. You should have just let me stay on the floor." I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "The doctor said you've known about the lupus for 8 months. Why did you stop taking medication?" Melissa was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw and honest in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Because I was so numb with jealousy, I wanted to feel something, even if it was pain. After your wedding, after everyone saw how successful you were, I felt like I was disappearing, like I was becoming invisible the way you'd always been. And the medication made everything feel muted, distant. At least the pain was real. At least it was mine." The logic was twisted and heartbreaking all at once. My sister had been so consumed by jealousy that she'd chosen physical suffering over emotional numbness. You could have died, I said quietly. I know. Melissa turned her face away. Part of me thought maybe that would be easier. Then I wouldn't have to face what I'd done to you, wouldn't have to live with being the person who tried to destroy her own sister out of spite. We sat in silence for a while, the beeping of monitors and distant hospital sounds filling the space between us. Finally, Melissa turned back to me, tears streaming down her face. I'm scared I'll die before I can make things right, she said, her voice breaking. She grabbed my hand weakly. Will you forgive me, sis? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the polished, confident woman who'd spent her life making me feel small, but a frightened, sick person who'd been fighting her own demons and losing. I saw someone who needed forgiveness but hadn't earned it yet, someone who wanted absolution without having done the work of repentance. I looked at her and said nothing, not yet. I left Melissa in that hospital room without giving her an answer. Over the following weeks, I thought about her question constantly. Forgiveness felt like something that should be earned, not freely, given just because someone was sick and scared. But I also understood in a way I hadn't before that Melissa's cruelty had come from her own pain. That didn't excuse it, but it complicated the simple narrative of villain and victim I'd been telling myself. Melissa started treatment again. I knew because she sent me updates, short factual emails about doctor's appointments and medication adjustments. I never responded, but I read every one. It felt like the right distance for now. Not forgiveness, but not complete abandonment either. The legal proceedings moved forward, with the grinding slowness of the justice system. My lawyers kept me informed about developments in the criminal cases against both Melissa and Richard Grant. In early March, they called to tell me that Grant was being arrested that afternoon at his office downtown. Federal charges: corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of documents, and a litany of other crimes that carried significant prison time. He's asked to make a statement before his arraignment, my lawyer said. He specifically requested that a copy be sent to you. I don't want to hear anything he has to say, I replied. I understand, but I'm legally obligated to inform you that the statement exists and is available if you change your mind. I told her I wouldn't change my mind. But curiosity is a persistent thing, and by that evening I found myself calling her back and asking her to send me the video file. It arrived in my email an hour later. I sat in our study with my laptop Daniel beside me and pressed play. Richard Grant appeared on screen sitting in what looked like his office. He was a distinguished man in his late 50s, silver-haired and well-dressed, but his face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Ms. Miller, he began, his voice rough. Kelly, I asked to make this statement because there are things you deserve to know before you read about them in court documents or newspaper articles. Things about who I am and why I did what I did. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. 34 years ago, I was 25 years old and dating a woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was beautiful and kind, and I was ambitious and selfish. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I wasn't ready to be a father. I wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. So, I left. His voice cracked. I abandoned her when she needed me most. I convinced myself she'd be fine, that she'd find someone better, that the baby you would be better off without me. The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles white. I built my business, made my fortune, and told myself I'd made the right choice, Grant continued. But the guilt never left. 2 years ago, I hired a private investigator to find out what had happened to Sarah and to you. That's when I learned Sarah had died in a car accident when you were 6, that you'd been adopted by the Hughes family, that you'd grown up and become this brilliant, successful woman. He wiped at his eyes. I watched you from a distance. Read articles about you, tracked your career. I told myself I was just keeping tabs, making sure you were okay. But the truth is, I was looking for some way to feel less guilty about abandoning you. My hands were shaking. Daniel reached over and took one of them, squeezing gently. When I saw the announcement about your wedding to Daniel Miller, something in me broke, Grant said. I knew Daniel's company. I knew it had the same structural vulnerabilities that had destroyed my own business 15 years ago. And I convinced myself that if I could destroy Millennium Holdings before it collapsed on its own, I'd be protecting you from the kind of financial devastation I'd experienced. That's how I justified it to myself, that I was finally being a father, finally protecting my daughter. He laughed bitterly. But that was a lie. The truth is, I was bitter that Daniel had beaten me in business multiple times. I was angry that you'd achieved success without me, that you didn't need a father's help. And when Melissa approached me with her plan, I saw an opportunity to hurt you both and convince myself it was protection. I was wrong about everything. Grant leaned closer to the camera. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know the truth before it comes out in court. I'm your biological father. I abandoned you before you were born, and then 34 years later, I tried to destroy the life you'd built. I'm sorry, Kelly, for all of it. You deserved so much better than me. The video ended. I sat in silence, staring at the blank screen. Daniel was quiet beside me, waiting for me to process. He's my father, I said finally, and the words felt surreal. Richard Grant is my biological father. Sarah Mitchell's letter mentioned my father had died, but that was a lie she told, so I'd stop asking questions. He didn't die. He just left. Kelly. No, I said, standing abruptly. No, he doesn't get to be my father. My father died 3 years ago. The man who adopted me, who watched me grow up, who wrote me that letter telling me he was proud that was my father. Richard Grant is just a man who donated DNA and then spent 3 decades running from the consequences. I walked to the laptop and deleted the video file. Then I called my lawyer. When the reporters asked me about Grant's statement, I said, tell them I have no comment beyond this. My father died 3 years ago. That man is a stranger. I watched the video twice, then deleted it. When reporters asked for comment, I said, my father died 3 years ago. That man is a stranger. Oh, Grant's trial was scheduled for June, but his lawyers were already negotiating a plea deal. I told my legal team I wanted no part of any victim impact statements or court proceedings. I'd given the evidence that proved my innocence and exposed his crimes. That was enough. I didn't owe him my presence or my words or any acknowledgement that his biological connection to me mattered. But the revelation changed something in how I thought about Melissa. Not that it excused what she'd done, but it added context I hadn't had before. She'd been right that night at the confrontation dinner, when she'd screamed about competing for love. Our mother had adopted me, first, had chosen me, and then had Melissa biologically. Whatever complicated feelings Elaine had about that choice had poisoned both our childhoods in different ways. In early April, Melissa sent me an email that was different from her usual medical updates. I have a chemotherapy appointment next Tuesday, it read. The doctor says the treatment is more effective if I have someone with me for support. I know I have no right to ask, but would you consider coming just this once? If it's too much, I understand. I stared at that email for 2 days. Daniel asked what I was going to do, and I told him honestly that I didn't know. Part of me wanted to delete it to maintain the distance I'd established. But another part of me remembered sitting in that hospital room, seeing my sister vulnerable and scared, remembered the complicated truth that people could be both victims and villains, could hurt you and be hurting themselves. On Tuesday morning, I drove to Mass General Hospital. Melissa was in the oncology waiting room, looking small and pale, in an oversized sweater. When she saw me walk in, her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered. "Don't make me regret it," I said, but my voice was gentler than the words. The chemotherapy session lasted 4 hours. I sat beside Melissa while the IV dripped poison into her veins to fight the disease attacking her body from the inside. We didn't talk much at first. I read work emails on my phone while she dozed occasionally, waking to sip water or adjust her position in the reclining chair. About halfway through, she said quietly, "Thank you for being here. I know you don't owe me anything." "I don't," I agreed, "but you're still my sister, even after everything." "Am I?" Melissa asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in her voice. "After what I did do, I still get to call you that." I thought about it carefully before answering. "I think that's something we'll have to figure out together, if we even want to." Over the next several weeks, I went to 3 more chemotherapy sessions with Melissa. Each time we talked a little more. Not about the betrayal yet, that felt too big, too raw, but about smaller things. About what our lives had been like growing up in the same house, but living completely different experiences. About the pressure she'd felt to be perfect, to maintain her position as the favoured child. About my own loneliness and isolation. During the 5th session in early May, Melissa was feeling particularly sick from the treatment. She'd barely eaten in 2 days, and the nausea made her weak and vulnerable. I was helping her sip ginger ale when she suddenly started crying. "I spent my whole life competing with you," she said, tears streaming down her pale face. "From the moment I was old enough to understand that you were adopted, I was terrified that Mum and Dad would love you more because they chose you. So I tried to be everything they wanted. Perfect grades, perfect looks, perfect social life. I turned myself into this performance of a daughter, and I hated you for being able to just exist without all that effort." "I wasn't just existing," I said quietly. "I was trying just as hard as you were. You just couldn't see it because we were trying to earn different things." "I know that now," Melissa said. "And the worst part is, I never realised you were always rooting for me. Even when I was cruel to you, even when I made your life hell, some part of you still wanted me to be happy. I saw it in the way you'd defend me when Dad criticised my choices, or how you'd help me with my resume, even though I never thanked you. You were being a sister to me the whole time, and I was being your enemy." The truth of that statement sat heavy between us. I had always wanted Melissa to succeed, had always hoped that maybe, if she was happy, she'd finally see me as someone worth knowing, but instead my kindness had been invisible to her, just another thing to resent. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," I told her honestly. "What you did almost destroyed my life. The scandal, the investigation, watching my reputation crumble, that was real damage, Melissa. That doesn't go away just because you're sick now or because you're finally being honest about why you did it." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to be different. To be better." I didn't answer right away. We sat in that hospital room with machines beeping and other patients in various stages of their own battles, and I thought about what forgiveness actually meant. Whether it was something you declared once and meant forever, or whether it was more complicated than that. My mother came to one of the sessions in late May. She sat on Melissa's other side, looking older than I remembered her face, lined with worry, and something that might have been regret. She watched me help Melissa with her water, watched me hold the basin when Melissa felt sick, watched this fragile, careful rebuilding happening between her daughters. After the session, when Melissa had gone to the bathroom, my mother touched my arm. "Thank you for being here for her. I know she doesn't deserve your kindness." "None of us deserved a lot of things," I said, "but we got them anyway, for better or worse." My mother nodded, understanding more in that statement than I'd said aloud. She'd failed both of us, just in different ways. Melissa, by loving her too conditionally, making her feel she had to earn affection through performance. Me, by never loving me enough, making me feel invisible and temporary. Both of us had grown up in the same house, but had been damaged by opposite forms of neglect. As Melissa's health slowly improved through April and into May, I realised something. Forgiveness isn't a moment, it's a choice you make every single day. I chose the first Saturday in June for the Foundation's official launch. The timing felt symbolic, almost exactly a year since my wedding, since Daniel had revealed my ownership of Millennium Holdings, since everything had begun to unravel, and then slowly, painfully rebuild itself into something new. The Second Chance Foundation occupied a renovated brownstone in the South End. We'd spent 3 months transforming it from a derelict building into a warm, welcoming space with offices for counsellors, meeting rooms for support groups, and a resource centre filled with information about adoption services, foster care systems, and legal advocacy. The walls were painted in soft, hopeful colours, and we'd commissioned artwork from former foster youth to hang throughout the building. The mission statement I'd written was simple: to provide support resources and community for adopted children, foster youth, and women who faced family rejection or professional sabotage. Because everyone deserves a second chance at belonging. My shirt. The press coverage leading up to the launch had been overwhelmingly positive. After months of scandal and vindication, the media had shifted their narrative about me. I was no longer just the CEO accused of fraud, or the woman betrayed by her own sister. Now I was the business leader turning personal trauma into social change, and the voice for adopted children everywhere. Features ran in Boston, Magazine, and The Globe. A producer from Good Morning America called about a possible interview. Daniel watched me navigate this new attention with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're allowed to enjoy this, you know," he said one evening when I was stress reading every article, every comment section looking for criticism. "I know," I said. "It's just strange. Being seen, being praised. I spent so long being invisible that this feels uncomfortable, like borrowed clothes that don't quite fit." "It fits," Daniel assured me. "You've earned this. You took something painful and turned it into something that will help thousands of people. That's not luck or publicity, that's character." Melissa had asked if she could volunteer at the foundation. It was a complicated request. She was still facing legal consequences for what she'd done. Her trial was scheduled for August, and her lawyers were negotiating a plea deal that would likely involve probation, community service, and restitution. But she'd been consistent in her treatment, honest in our conversations, and genuinely committed to being different than she'd been. "I want to help people who feel the way I felt," she told me. "Women who are so consumed by jealousy or insecurity that they can't see they're destroying themselves. Maybe if I can share my story, warn them about where that path leads, something good can come from all the damage I caused." After 2 weeks of deliberation and consultation with my board of directors, I'd agreed. Melissa joined as volunteer coordinator, working with other volunteers, organising events, and eventually, when she was ready, speaking to women's groups about her experience. Our relationship remained fragile, careful, but it was genuine in a way it had never been before. The launch gala was held at a hotel ballroom overlooking the harbour. We'd invited donors, community leaders, social workers, representatives from adoption agencies and former foster youth who'd aged out of the system. My mother came sitting quietly in the back with my father, both of them looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. We'd had several painful conversations over the past months, working through the adoption revelation and the years of failed parenting. We weren't healed, but we were trying. Daniel gave the opening remarks talking about resilience and second chances and the importance of creating communities of support for people who'd been told they didn't belong. Then he introduced me. I stood at the podium looking out at 200 faces, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I told my story, not at all of it, not the most painful parts, but enough. About being adopted and not knowing it. About feeling like an outsider in my own family. About the betrayal and the scandal and the long, difficult work of rebuilding trust and identity. This foundation exists because I needed it to exist, I said. Because somewhere out there's a 6-year-old girl who just lost her mother and doesn't understand why the new family can't love her the way she needs. There's a teenager aging out of foster care with no support system and no one who believes in her. There's a woman facing professional sabotage and wondering if she'll ever be trusted again. This foundation is for them, for all of us who've had to fight for belonging. The applause was thunderous. Several people were crying. Melissa, standing near the volunteer table, was openly weeping. After the speeches, we opened the donation envelopes that had been arriving all week. Small donations, large donations, corporate matching gifts. Daniel and I sat at a table in the corner, opening them one by one and recording the amounts. We'd raised over $300,000 before the gala even started. Then, I opened an envelope that made me pause. Inside was a check for $2 million. The signature line read simply, DM Senior. Daniel, I said quietly, holding up the check. Who is DM Senior? He looked at it and I watched his face go through a series of expressions. Confusion, realization, and then something that looked like wonder mixed with tears. That's my father, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's my dad. At the foundation's opening gala, we received an anonymous donation of $2 million signed only DM Sir. I looked at Daniel. Who is that? Your dad, I repeated, looking at the check again. Daniel, this is $2 million. Why would your father donate this much to my foundation? I've never even met him. Daniel was staring at the check with an expression I couldn't quite read. He's not just donating to your foundation, Kelly. He stopped, shook his head, and pulled out his phone. I need to call him. Right now. He stepped away from the table, and I watched him walk to a quiet corner of the ballroom, phone pressed to his ear. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but I could see Daniel's body language change, tension in his shoulders, releasing, his free hand coming up to cover his eyes. When he came back, there were tears on his face. He's on his way here, Daniel said. He says he needs to tell you something in person, something he's wanted to tell you for months. 20 minutes later, an older gentleman in his early 70s walked into the ballroom. He had Daniel's eyes and the same careful way of moving through a room, assessing everything before committing. Daniel met him at the entrance, and they embraced, the kind of hug that spoke of deep affection and complicated history. Daniel brought him over to where I was standing, my heart racing with a confusion I couldn't name. Kelly, Daniel said, this is my father, David Miller. Dad, this is my wife, Kelly. David Miller took my hand in both of his. His grip was warm and firm, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Mrs. Miller, he said, I've wanted to meet you for a very long time. Mr. Miller, I said, bewildered. Thank you for the extraordinarily generous donation, but I have to admit, I don't understand. 16 years ago? He interrupted gently. My construction company went bankrupt. We lost everything. Our house was going into foreclosure. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. I was standing in my garage one night looking at a rope, thinking about how my family would be better off with the life insurance money than with a failure of a father. Daniel made a small sound beside me, and I realized he'd never heard this part of the story. That same week, David continued, my wife received a letter from our son's high school. A community scholarship fund had been established, they said, and we'd been selected to receive $5,000. No strings attached, just help when we needed it most. His voice broke. That money saved us, not just financially, though it stopped the foreclosure and gave us breathing room, but psychologically. Someone out there, someone who didn't even know us, had cared enough to help. It gave me a reason to keep fighting. I felt my throat tighten. I knew where this was going, but I couldn't quite believe it. For 16 years, I wondered who that person was, David said. The school counselor said it was anonymous, that the donor wanted no recognition. I accepted that, but I never forgot. How could I? That person saved my life. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. 2 years ago, when Daniel told me he was dating someone seriously, I did what any father would do. I looked her up. And something about your background, your story, stuck with me. So I hired an investigator, not to pry into your life, but to trace that scholarship fund from 16 years ago. He handed me the envelope. Inside were bank records, transaction histories, a paper trail that led from the Community Scholarship Fund back to a high school savings account opened in my name when I was 17. It took them 4 months to find the connection, David said. By then, Daniel had already proposed, and I realised my son had found completely by chance the girl who'd saved our family. The girl who'd worked 3 jobs and gave us everything she'd earned because she understood what it meant to lose everything. Tears were streaming down my face now. Daniel's arm was around my waist, holding me steady. If not for you, none of us would be here, David said simply. I wouldn't have survived that night in the garage. My wife wouldn't have had a husband. Daniel wouldn't have had a father to help him build his company. Everything good in our lives traces back to an 18-year-old girl who saw someone suffering and decided to help, even though it cost her everything she had. I didn't do it for recognition, I whispered. I saw someone who needed help. I know, David said. That's what makes it matter. You helped because it was right, not because anyone would know. And now you're building this foundation on that same principle, helping people not for recognition, but because they need it. He gestured to the check still in my hand. $2 million isn't enough to repay what you gave us, but it's a start. And if your foundation needs more, you call me. Whatever you need to help people the way you helped us. Daniel was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. He laughed through his tears and said, Even my father knew your worth before anyone in your family did. The truth of that statement hit me with unexpected force. My biological father had abandoned me. My adoptive mother had resented me. My sister had tried to destroy me. But this man, this stranger whose life I'd touched briefly 16 years ago, had spent 2 years searching for me just to say thank you, had donated $2 million to support my mission, had seen my value when my own family couldn't. We stood there in the ballroom, the 3 of us, while the gala continued around us. David told stories about how they'd rebuilt after the bankruptcy, how that $5,000 had been the turning point. Daniel talked about growing up knowing his family had been saved by an anonymous angel, never imagining he'd end up marrying her. And I listened, trying to comprehend how one small act of kindness had rippled forward through time to come back to me when I needed it most. Later, after David had left and the gala was winding down, Daniel and I stood by the windows overlooking Boston Harbor. The summer sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. I stared out at the evening sky and whispered to Daniel, Everything really does come full circle, doesn't it? He kissed my forehead gently and said, Only for people who deserve it. Daniel suggested the vow renewal in late June, exactly 1 week before our first anniversary. We were having breakfast on our balcony when he reached across the table and took my hand. I want to marry you again, he said. I looked up from my coffee startled. We're already married. I know, he said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. But our wedding was overshadowed by so much pain. The revelation about your ownership, the tension with your family, Melissa watching, with that look we didn't understand yet. I want to stand in front of the people we love and make those promises again, but this time without all the weight of secrets and betrayal. So we planned something small and intimate for our anniversary weekend, the same July date as our original wedding, but entirely different in tone. No grand ballroom, no 200 guests, no dramatic revelations. Just 30 people who'd been part of our journey through the hardest year of my life. We chose the same garden overlooking the harbour where we'd held our first ceremony. It felt right to return to the place where we'd begun to complete the circle. The weather cooperated, giving us a perfect summer evening with a gentle breeze off the water and golden light filtering through the trees. I wore a simple cream dress, nothing like the elaborate gown from last year. This one felt more like me, understated, elegant, comfortable. When I looked at myself in the mirror before the ceremony, I saw someone I recognized completely, not the invisible daughter or the betrayed sister or the accused CEO, Just Kelly, just myself. Melissa helped me get ready in the small dressing room. We worked in comfortable, near silence, her adjusting my dress, me fixing her hair. The silence between us was no longer awkward or tense. It was the silence of two people who'd learned to exist together without performance or pretense. "You look beautiful," she said, stepping back to examine her work. "Thank you." I paused, then added, "Thank you for being here, for everything." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you for letting me be here, for giving me a second chance I definitely didn't deserve." "We all need second chances," I said. "That's kind of the whole point, isn't it?" My mother knocked on the door then, and I felt my stomach tighten reflexively. Our relationship was still healing, still tender, but we'd made genuine progress through months of therapy and difficult conversations. "Kelly," she said softly, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Melissa quietly excused herself, leaving us alone. My mother stood there holding a bouquet of peonies and garden roses, my favourite flowers, though I'd never told her that. She must have asked Daniel. "I wanted to give you this," she said, holding out the bouquet with trembling hands. In Jewish tradition, the mother walks the bride down the aisle. I know we're not Jewish, and I know I don't have the right to ask, but I was hoping you'd let me walk with you today. Let me do it right, this time. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. "Mum!" "You are beautiful, my daughter," Elaine said, her own tears falling freely now. "You've always been beautiful and brilliant, and so much stronger than any of us. I'm sorry it took me so long to see you. I'm sorry I wasted so many years resenting you for not being who I expected, instead of celebrating who you were. I'm sorry I failed you when you needed a mother most." I took the bouquet from her hands and pulled her into a hug. We stood there crying together, 35 years of hurt and misunderstanding, finally beginning to dissolve into something that might eventually become love. The ceremony itself was simple and perfect. My mother walked me down the aisle, her hand steady on my arm. My father sat in the front row, openly crying for maybe the first time in my memory. David Miller was there with Daniel's mother, both of them beaming. And Melissa stood at the altar, waiting, healthy and whole and genuinely smiling. Daniel and I exchanged the same vows we'd written a year ago, but they meant something different now. When he promised to honour me, I knew he meant it, because he'd proven it through the hardest months. When I promised to trust him, I meant it because we'd built that trust back from rubble. Before the officiant pronounced us married again, I asked for a moment to read something. I pulled out the letter my father had written before he died, the one I'd found in December during my identity crisis. "My father wrote this 3 years ago," I told the gathering. "I only found it 6 months ago, but it changed everything for me. I want to read part of it now, because it represents something I've learnt this year, about what family really means." I read the section about being his daughter by choice rather than by blood, about him watching me become strong and capable, and wishing he'd had the courage to tell me he was proud, about regretting that I'd had to fight alone when I should have had parents fighting beside me. "Family isn't about biology," I said when I finished reading. "It's about choice. It's about the people who see you when you're invisible, who stay when things get hard, who choose you every single day, even when it would be easier to walk away. My father chose me when I was 6 years old and traumatized and difficult to love. Daniel chose me when he could have chosen anyone. Melissa is choosing to be my sister in a real way for the first time in our lives. My mother is choosing to finally see me, and I'm choosing all of them back." The ceremony ended with Daniel and me kissing while everyone applauded. We danced as the sun set over the harbour, the same view as last year, but everything different, better, real. Later that evening, after most guests had left and we were standing alone on the terrace, overlooking the water, Daniel pulled me close. The city lights were beginning to twinkle across Boston, and somewhere in the distance a boat horn sounded its low, mournful note. "A year ago," he said quietly, "I stood at that microphone and told everyone who you really were. I thought that was enough. That being seen would fix everything." "It wasn't enough," I said, "but it was necessary. It was the beginning." "And now?" he asked. I thought about the journey from that moment to this one, the scandal and the betrayal, the adoption revelation and the identity crisis, the slow, painful work of forgiveness and healing, the foundation we'd built both literally and figuratively, the relationships we'd salvaged and the ones we'd chosen to walk away from. "Now I understand something I didn't then," I said. "Being seen by others matters, but being seen by yourself matters more. This whole year has been about learning to see myself clearly, not through my family's eyes, not through society's expectations, not even through your love for me, just through my own honest assessment of who I am and what I'm worth." "And what are you worth?" Daniel asked, though there was a smile in his voice because he already knew my answer. "Everything," I said simply. "I'm worth everything I've fought for, everything I've built, everything I've become. Not because someone gave that worth to me, but because I claimed it for myself." Daniel kissed my forehead, then my cheeks where tears had dried, then my lips. "I knew that about you from the beginning. I'm glad you finally know it too." We stood there as the evening deepened into night, as the garden lights came on and cast everything in a warm golden glow. Melissa was inside talking with our mother, both of them laughing at something David Miller had said. My father was showing Daniel's parents' photos on his phone. Everyone we loved was in this space, choosing to be here, choosing us. As the music played and Daniel held me close, I whispered, "I finally understand what real love looks like. It's not who shares your blood. It's who chooses to stay." 6 months after we renewed our vows, I found myself standing at a podium in front of 300 women at the Second Chance Foundation's first annual conference. The event was titled Redefining Worth Stories of Women Who Chose Themselves, and I was the closing keynote speaker. Outside, the first snow of December was falling softly over Boston, and inside the ballroom was warm with the energy of women who'd survived their own battles with invisibility, rejection, and the long journey towards self-definition. I looked out at the audience and saw faces that reflected pieces of my own story. Adopted daughters who'd spent childhoods feeling like outsiders. Foster youth who'd aged out of the system with no safety net. Women who'd been professionally sabotaged by people they'd trusted. Survivors of family cruelty who were learning slowly that family could be chosen rather than endured. Melissa was sitting in the third row taking notes. She'd developed the youth mentorship program that now served 40 teenagers transitioning out of foster care, helping them navigate college applications, job searches, and the terrifying freedom of independence. She still had difficult days when the lupus made her tired, days when the weight of what she'd done to me felt unbearable, but she showed up. Every single day she chose to show up and do better. My mother sat beside her volunteering now, as a parent liaison helping adoptive families navigate the complex emotions of raising children who'd experienced trauma. It was her way of atoning, I think, of trying to understand what she should have understood 30 years ago. We had dinner together once a month now, just the two of us, and the conversations were getting easier. Not perfect, not healed, but honest in a way they'd never been before. Daniel was in the back of the room, leaning against the wall, with David Miller beside him. They'd both insisted on coming to support me, even though this was technically a women-only event. I'd made an exception for them because they'd earned it, because they'd shown me what it meant to be seen and valued and chosen. I began my speech with the story everyone had come to hear, the dress fitting, the whispered cruelty, the moment that had broken me and ultimately remade me. 18 months ago, I said. I stood in a bridal boutique wearing a wedding dress I thought was beautiful. My sister looked at me and said to her friend just loud enough for me to hear, "She looks like a fat pig bride in that dress." My mother heard her. She said nothing, and I stood there staring at my reflection in the mirror, watching 34 years of accumulated hurt finally break through the surface. The room was absolutely silent. "I want to be honest with you," I continued. "In that moment, I believed her. I believed I was unworthy. I believed the dress was a mistake, that my engagement was a mistake, that my entire existence was this embarrassing thing my family had to tolerate. Because that's what happens when you spend a lifetime being told you're invisible. Eventually, you start to believe it's true." I saw several women in the audience nodding, tears already in their eyes. "But here's what I didn't know then," I said. My fiancé walked into that fitting room and saw me crying. And instead of telling me to ignore it, instead of minimizing my pain, he got angry. He got protective. And he said something that changed everything. "I think it's time they knew exactly who you are." I told them about the wedding revelation, about Daniel announcing my ownership of Millennium Holdings, about the shock on my family's faces the moment when everything I'd built in secret was suddenly irrevocably visible. "I thought that moment was the end of the story," I said. "I thought being seen, being recognized would fix everything, but that was just the beginning." I walked them through the scandal, the betrayal, the discovery that my own sister had tried to destroy me. I talked about learning I was adopted, about the identity crisis that followed, about having to rebuild myself from the foundation up, when I realized I didn't even know who I was without the family narrative I'd been living inside. "The hardest part wasn't the betrayal," I said. "It was the question that followed. If I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I?" I paused, letting that question sit in the room. It took me months to answer that. Months of therapy, of difficult conversations, of sitting with discomfort and uncertainty. And what I finally realized was this: I am who I choose to be. Not who my family said I was. Not who biology determined. Not who circumstances tried to make me. Who I choose. I told them about the foundation, about turning pain into purpose. About choosing forgiveness, not as a gift to people who'd hurt me, but as freedom for myself. About learning that family could be created, that worth could be self-defined, that the only approval I truly needed was my own. They called me a fat pig bride, unworthy and invisible. I said, my voice strong and clear. That was the day I learned my worth isn't defined by their vision, it's defined by my truth. And my truth is this: I am brilliant, I am capable, I am worthy of love and respect and all the success I've worked for. Not because I proved it to them, but because I proved it to myself. The applause started before I finished speaking, building into a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Women were crying, embracing each other, and I stood at that podium feeling something I'd never felt before, complete and absolute certainty in my own value. After the speech, dozens of women lined up to talk to me. They shared their stories, some similar to mine, some entirely different, but all of them marked by the same struggle to be seen, to be valued, to be enough. I listened to each one, offered what wisdom I could, and watched as they walked away, standing a little taller. That evening, Daniel and I walked home through the snow. We lived in the North End now, in the same apartment I'd had when we first reconnected, because neither of us wanted something ostentatious. We were wealthy, Millennium Holdings was thriving, the foundation was fully funded. We had more money than we'd ever need, but we'd learned that success measured in zeros on a bank statement was hollow, compared to success measured in lives changed and relationships healed. "You were incredible today," Daniel said, his arm around my shoulders. "I meant every word," I replied. For the first time in my life, I actually believe it. We stopped at a corner watching the snowfall under the streetlights. Somewhere across the city, Melissa was probably closing up the foundation office. My mother was likely at home, maybe reading the book on trauma and adoption I'd recommended. David Miller was probably telling his wife about the speech he'd witnessed, all these people connected by choice and circumstance, forming a family that looked nothing like what I'd imagined, but felt exactly right. "Do you ever think about Grant?" Daniel asked quietly. "About the fact that he's your biological father?" "No," I said honestly. "He's just someone who shares my DNA. He made choices that meant he forfeited any claim to being my father. That title belongs to the man who adopted me, who chose me, who wrote me a letter telling me I was precious. Biology doesn't make family, choice does." Daniel kissed the top of my head. "Have I told you lately that I'm proud of you?" "You tell me every day," I said, smiling, "but I never get tired of hearing it." We walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When we got home, I made tea while Daniel started a fire in the fireplace. We sat together on the couch, my feet in his lap, talking about the Foundation's plans for next year, about the new mentorship program Melissa was developing, about nothing and everything. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I thought about that day in the bridal boutique, about the woman who'd stood there believing she was unworthy. And I thought about the woman standing here now, scarred, yes, but whole, complicated but certain, imperfect but enough. Someone once told me that the best revenge is becoming so successful and happy that you forget why you wanted revenge in the first place. They were right. I'm not standing taller than their insults. I'm standing taller than I ever thought possible. And that changes everything. So that's my story. That's how I went from being the invisible daughter, the family embarrassment, the woman they called a fat pig bride, to someone who finally understands her own worth. It wasn't a straight line from pain to triumph. It was messy and complicated, and there were days I wanted to give up. Days when I wondered if forgiveness was weakness, if healing was even possible, if I'd ever stop feeling like that 6-year-old girl who lost her mother and spent the next 28 years trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it. But here's what I learned, and I hope you take this with you. Your worth is not determined by the people who can't see it, not by your family, not by the people who betray you, not by anyone who makes you feel small. Your worth is inherent. It exists whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And the moment you truly understand that, the moment you stop waiting for external validation and start defining yourself on your own terms, everything changes. The Second Chance Foundation serves over 200 people now. We've helped foster youth transition to independent living. We've connected adopted children with therapists who specialise in trauma. We've provided legal advocacy for women facing professional sabotage. Every single one of those people represents someone who was told they weren't enough. And every single one of them is learning what I learned, that you get to define yourself. Melissa completed her community service and probation. She's been in lupus remission for over a year now. She manages our youth mentorship program, and she's good at it because she understands what it means to be consumed by jealousy and insecurity. Our relationship will never be what it could have been if we'd grown up differently. But it's real now. It's honest. And that's worth more than the shallow sisterhood we pretended to have for 34 years. My mother and I have dinner once a month. We talk about things we never talked about before. She's told me about her own insecurities as a mother, about the pressure she felt. I've told her about the years of invisibility, about learning I was adopted and feeling like everything finally made sense. We're not healed, but we're healing. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. Daniel and I are talking about starting a family. It's complicated for me, this idea of becoming a parent when my own experience was so fractured. But I think about that 6-year-old girl who lost her mother, and I think about all the love she needed and didn't get, and I want to give that love to someone else. I want to choose a child the way my father chose me. I want to prove that family is built, not born. Richard Grant is serving 8 years in federal prison. I've never visited him, never written to him, never acknowledged his existence beyond the legal proceedings. People ask me sometimes if I'm curious about him, if there's any part of me that wants a relationship with my biological father. And the answer is no. Not because I'm angry anymore, but because I genuinely don't need him. I have a father. He's been dead for 3 years, but he's more present in my life than Grant ever was or ever will be. I think about that day in the bridal boutique often, not with pain anymore, but with something like gratitude. Because that moment, that terrible, humiliating moment when my sister called me a fat pig bride, that moment was the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes the worst moments in your life are the ones that force you to finally become who you were always meant to be. So if you're watching this and you feel invisible in your own family, if you're the one who's always overlooked or dismissed or made to feel like you're not enough, I want you to hear this. You are enough. Exactly as you are. Your family's inability to see your worth is about their limitations, not yours. And you have a choice. You can keep trying to make blind people see, or you can walk into the light yourself and find people who already have their eyes open. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced something similar, or know someone who has, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your story. Tell me about the moment you realized you were worth more than the people around you believed. Tell me about your journey from invisible to visible, from defined by others to self-defined. Your story matters. Your experience matters. And someone else watching this might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories. We share real experiences from real people who've faced betrayal, family dysfunction, professional sabotage, and the long, difficult journey toward healing and self-worth. This is a community of people who understand what it means to rebuild yourself from the ground up. You're not alone in this. Leave a comment telling me what's one thing you've learned about your own worth. What was the moment you realized you didn't need other people's approval to be valuable? I read every single comment, and I love seeing this community support each other. Before I go, I want to leave you with something my father wrote in his letter. He said that some people are born into families that celebrate them, and some people have to build families that do. He said that being chosen is just as powerful as being born into, maybe more powerful because it's intentional. It's deliberate. It's someone looking at you and saying, you specifically, you, I choose you. So if you're still waiting to be chosen by people who've already decided not to choose you, stop waiting. Choose yourself. Build your own family from people who see you. Define your own worth based on your truth, not their perception. And remember that the best revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's becoming so successful, so happy, so completely yourself that you forget why you ever wanted revenge in the first place. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. Subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Remember, you're not standing taller than the insults thrown at you. You're standing taller than you ever thought possible. And that changes everything.